Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, this is that time of the week. That time when we bring on a friend of mine who is much more knowledgeable than I on the frontiers of foreign policy, economics, and world history. This is not a podcast, though it will be exported to YouTube later on. This is episode 40 of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Moss Neotech Prototype is stepping up to the plate. He will take your questions. You can be part of this conversation. Just tag him and say, "This is my question for Agent Smith." He will pass that along if it is a good and appropriate question. Without further ado, I'm going to jump into the Discord. Let's see what he's doing. Agent Smith.
Hello?
What's up, dude?
Hey, what's up?
Oh, doing the thing, doing the stream.
How you been the past couple weeks?
Pretty well. So, I had one of those sleep schedule going around the clock things last week. And then the week before that, we had a collaboration drinking stream with a bunch of different broadcasters.
Ah, I saw that. That was fun.
Yeah. It was more fun the night of than the next day. I was hurting a little bit. But yeah, it was a pretty cool journey. And you usually ask, like, what's the thing that has stood out to you? I feel like you don't have to, just because there's, like, one big thing that is at the center of everything right now. And surprisingly enough, it's not really Trump or North Korea. So we've got Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and journalists. That's kind of the thing that happened. What's the TLDR for people who don't know what this is?
Well, basically there was a Saudi journalist who had actually been at one point an advisor to the Saudi government. But eventually he got disenchanted with the direction the government was going under Mohammed bin Salman, the current prince, who is basically in power. And he came to the United States and started writing dissident articles in the Washington Post, complaining about the direction of the government and criticizing Saudi policies of one sort or another, usually foreign policy stuff, I think. So eventually he ended up over in Turkey, and he was trying to get some, I think it was some documentation in order to finalize his divorce, because he wanted to marry his new girlfriend, I guess, who she was, or his fiance or whoever. And he went to the Saudi consulate, I think it was, maybe it was the embassy. I think it was the embassy, the Saudi embassy in Turkey. And he basically just never came out. And he told his fiance/girlfriend that if he did not come back within a certain period of time, that he should call basically a contact in the Turkish government. And so that pretty much led up to where we are now, where everybody kind of suspects that the Saudi government killed this journalist in the embassy because he was a dissident. So that's the short of it. Since that time, the Saudis have been tying themselves in knots, trying to come up with some excuse to try to explain it away. You know, at first they just said that he disappeared, that he left the embassy and that they didn't know what happened to him, but that they hoped somebody figured it out. Well, that didn't last for long, because it turned out that the Turks, or the Turkish government more accurately, claimed to have some audio and video of this journalist being interrogated, tortured, and killed, supposedly. They haven't released the audio or the video yet, but supposedly that's the evidence that he was assassinated there. It may be that they had the embassy bugged and they actually do have the audio. It's not clear yet. But thus far, the Saudis have not been able to deflect the pressure that's been growing against them. And so they've started to relent a bit over the past week. You know, it changed to basically, okay, yeah, he never left the embassy, something happened to him, and then it was, now what was the next thing? I think it was that there was a botched interrogation. And I think now they're saying that there were rogue killers, that the Saudi government had not ordered him killed, but that elements of the Saudi intelligence agency had done so. basically against the government's wishes.
It's just silly. They might as well just give a silly story, like he fell into the toilet or something. The world isn't that stupid. Like, we're pretty stupid, but we're not that stupid.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that he was assassinated and probably done so at the behest of the Saudi government. So the real question now is, how does the world respond to that? And probably there won't be much response, because nominally it's a Saudi issue. It's kind of then an internal problem for them. I imagine there will be some token action taken, but I doubt it'll be substantive. You know, we've already, the Trump administration, and specifically Donald Trump himself, has already released statements to that effect. Basically that there would be some punishment, but that the U.S. government would, U.S. interest would be hurt more than they would benefit from serious sanctions against the Saudis.
Yeah, so for us, it's all about just being very disappointed.
Yeah. It's going to be symbolic sanctions of one sort or another, and very limited sanctions at that. If even that much. And it'll probably be done by the Senate. And there will probably be some discussion there and some finger wagging, some investigating, and then that'll be the end of it, most likely. Ultimately, it comes down to raw interests, and American interests, as they're defined by this government, are such that these issues are kind of secondary to overarching strategic goals in the Middle East. And those goals are, in their opinion, and in the opinion of many other people outside the administration, best served by aligning with the Saudis and kind of overlooking their human rights record.
Right, so it's kind of weighing is it worth it from a moral and ethical standpoint to take a stand here against the amount of revenue, control, and stability that the U.S. is getting in the region? And it seems like Saudi Arabia has been kind of our country that's in the region, that's in our pocket, so to speak. So we're kind of looking for a way to excuse them. But I've seen, it's been like every few hours there's another country that's saying they're not going to some thing. What is this thing? There's a thing, and it's like Australia's not going to do it, and Germany is upset, and everyone's upset. But I don't know.
Davos in the desert is the cutesy nickname they gave it. Basically, Mohammed bin Salman, basically the Saudi government, has been trying to transition the economy away from being a monoculture, basically. They want to transition it away from being so reliant on the oil industry and to try to diversify it into other sectors, basically to try to modernize the Saudi economy. It's kind of like what Texas did in the 1980s after the big oil bust then. There was a desire to make sure that the Texas economy would never be hurt like that again because of that over-dependence on oil revenues. And so there was a big effort to try to create incentives for producers in other sectors to try to come to Texas or to set up shop in Texas. So the Saudis are kind of having that moment right now, and they've been, one of the ways that they want to do that is to have to attract investment into other sectors besides the oil sector in Saudi Arabia. And they have this big event organized to try to get big institutional investors as well as governments and anybody else who has power to come to this event to try to discuss investment opportunities in Saudi Arabia and maybe get some projects going. So that's what countries have been pulling out of. But it's kind of a symbolic thing, because the government, it's mostly been governments that have pulled out, but most of the private sector actors that had planned to go are still going. I don't think there's really been any significant private sector entities, companies, multinationals, what have you, that have decided to pull out because of the incident. So mostly it is governments, and so mostly political actors in that sense. So most likely it won't have much of an impact on the event. So long as the private sector is there, that's going to be the important thing for them, because the private sector is the one with all the investor dollars. Right. Governments can help, in one way or the other, but if they're missing, yeah, it's manageable for them. So that's what you're hearing about when you hear about this, that, or the other government pulling out of that event.
We love our symbolism.
Well, I mean, it's the oil that makes international relations work. I mean, you can't get hung up on every little thing, or every big thing, as the case may be.
Yeah, it's not like anyone was murdered or anything.
Well, that's the problem, though. I mean, when you're dealing with states that are authoritarian or, unstable or what have you, they have problems of one sort or another, there's going to be issues. So you have to make a judgment call as to what the trade-offs are between taking action when those incidents arise or letting it slide. And the Middle East certainly has no shortage of such incidents, so there's quite a few such judgment calls that have to be made. Yeah, to be fair to the Saudis, I wouldn't say that they're quite in the pocket of the United States, because that implies that we kind of are their boss. You know, that the U.S. government can really push them around.
Oh, I guess, yeah, that was probably a bad phrase. What I meant in terms of my perception was that we have a very kind of long-standing and multifaceted financial relationship with them. Not that they're our puppet or anything, but that we're kind of historically connected. They've done stuff for us, we've done stuff for them, and it kind of behooves us to keep that intact rather than to like cut them out entirely because of this.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's a long-standing partnership. You know, basically the Saudis don't really have the capacity to fully defend themselves in the region. You know, nominally they have a lot of money, but they don't really have the institutions or the military standing. You know, a large enough, powerful enough military to really deflect the pressure that could be brought from a rival state like, say, Iran, if they were to face them alone. So they depend on the United States to kind of play that role as a sword and shield on their behalf. And in exchange, they give the United States some leeway, some voice in how they set their oil policy. You know, if we ask them to produce a little more or a little less, generally more is the ask, but generally we only ask during particularly stressful periods for the U.S. economy or in international relations. Generally, if we give that ask, they'll kind of listen and throw us a bone. And they won't say, have an embargo if something happens that aggravates them. That's what happened in the 1970s. You know, a big part of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East today is centered around preventing a reoccurrence of the early 70s, which is when pretty much all of the major oil-producing nations in the Arab Middle East cut off the West, and the United States in particular had a big oil embargo, and it had some seriously deleterious effects on the Western economy, and the U.S. again, the U.S. economy in particular. So avoiding such an eventuality that ultimately was only resolved by an implicit threat of force by the Nixon administration has been an important foreign policy goal in the Middle East. So maintaining stable relations with the Saudis isn't just about getting their cooperation on oil production or in security operations in the region. It's also about trying to be on good terms with them so that they don't use their leverage against us in a way that is inimical to U.S. interests. I remembered the word this time. That's the one I was struggling with a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, it's one of the themes that we've come up with a whole bunch throughout this segment is stability being a major driving force in terms of what countries want, in terms of just allowing you to make predictions on what's going to be happening within a system so that you can capitalize on that, benefit from it in certain ways, and also kind of anticipate what's about to happen. So Saudi Arabia is kind of that aspect of we understand how they relate to the other pieces in the region, and they've had positive relations with us in certain capacities, so prioritizing that stability over the moral, I wouldn't really call it grandstanding, but it is kind of representing, like, you did something wrong and now we're gonna take action against you. It's kind of like, it's easier for countries who are less entangled and committed with Saudi Arabia to make that stand because it doesn't really lose them anything. Whereas the US is going to be hesitant toward that because it's a point of stability and it's a long-standing relationship.
Yeah, that's a good summary. You know, there's a... You know, it's sort of the flip side of invading Iraq to impose democracy. You know, that trade-off did not pay off pretty explicitly, and so that's kind of the reason that relations with the Saudis tend to emphasize stability. There's never really been much expectation that if there was an attempt to really replace the government there with something that was more amiable to American sentiments, specifically what you would call classical liberalism, or even just modern sentiments of how society should be run. There's little faith that if there was a democracy imposed on Saudi Arabia, that any kind of modern liberal party would really win. It would probably be mostly conservatives that would win such an election. So, also, there's a lot of wealthy actors in the Saudi Arabia who would delight in the opportunity to give more of their money to radical actors in the Middle East, if not elsewhere. As is, there are those actors that do that, but their activity is mitigated by the efforts of the Saudi authorities, who don't really want them to do that. Contrary to popular belief, the Saudi authorities are actually as threatened, if not more threatened, by radical Islamists than pretty much any other authority in the region. Mostly, it's lower levels of Saudi society that do the supporting in that vein. It's lower levels of the Saudi royal family or even just other actors in Saudi Arabia who do that. The Saudi authorities don't want those people running around. Because they don't get along with the Saudi monarchy. Again, we've talked a little bit about this before, but in Islam, you're not really supposed to have monarchies.
Yeah.
According to Islamic tenets, society is supposed to be run by a religiously knowledgeable, pious person. You're not supposed to have a hereditary monarchy just sort of monopolizing power.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a theocracy.
Yeah, exactly. So in that sense, the Saudi royal family and the Saudi monarchy is, in a sense, kind of an anachronism and associated somewhat with foreigners, since they did partly come to power with the support of foreigners. I don't think they're as tainted as some of the other royal families that were installed after World War I, because I think the Saudis did technically conquer Arabia on their own, more or less, but they've received a fair amount of support and have close ties with foreign governments. So that damages their legitimacy a bit. They try to make up for that by supporting religious actors. That's traditionally been the trade-off. We're going to keep power, but in exchange we'll help out clerics and Salafism and these other sorts of religious sects in exchange for their support, or at least their toleration of our power. That had been the status quo up until Mohammed bin Salman came along, and he's been kind of upsetting that relationship, and he's kind of been trying to reset it. I don't know if he wants to break with it completely, but he's been trying to push modernizing reforms that have kind of sidelined some of the preferences of the clerisy in Saudi Arabia. How far he is able to go with that or wants to go with it is unclear at this point, because it's still very much a process that's still unfolding. It's not really clear entirely what the game plan is over the long term, but we'll see. Nominally, that is something that they're doing, so we could see a very different Saudi Arabia over the long term if that plan does pan out in the way that he's kind of described it thus far.
It almost kind of reminds me of Sale of Indulgences, where it's like they're breaking an aspect of the religious code and kind of paying for it by doing other things that you're supposed to do. And then it's like, they're still sort of allowed to pass because of that.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to do that, but if you do some community service, then I guess we'll let you off.
Yeah, there's a similar phenomena in a sect of Buddhism. I don't remember which one it was. I want to say it was Mahayana Buddhism, but I don't know enough about Buddhism to know if that's right. I haven't studied enough. But basically, the idea was you're supposed to do good deeds in order to get good karma, in order to break the cycle of reincarnation. But there was this one sect that came up with the idea that a good deed could be defined as contributing funds to the local temple, which is a nice out if you're a wealthy rich guy who hasn't really done a lot of good deeds. So, if you're kind of an asshole, but you'd want to break the cycle of reincarnation, you can kind of just dump a bunch of money on some temples, and that'll get you some points. It's a nice out. So yeah, there's a fair amount of that in religious institutions. It's probably a push and pull between, on the one hand, trying to entice people who are otherwise not inclined to observe good morality, try to get them to at least do something that's at least somewhat good, and also self-interest on the part of religious institutions that either want or need resources in order to perform their duties, or just be greedy, depending on the institution involved. Fair amount of that, and the Saudis are not exempt from that. That is a kind of devil's bargain they've made. We'll see how it pans out. But that's all an explanation of why the Saudis are not really on board with Islamic extremists. They're not really buddies. They might work with them in other countries if it suits their purposes. You know, they supported jihadis in the Afghan war against the Soviets, and supposedly they've supported some in Syria against the Iranians. So, you know, if there's a rival country involved, they might lend some support outside their borders, but they definitely don't want them inside their borders. There was a fair amount of terrorist activity over the course of, what, the 80s and 90s, I want to say. Maybe more the 90s. They had to clamp down on that, try to stop it. They didn't have a problem working with the U.S. after 9/11 either. You know, they were very much part of that coalition. They didn't contribute troops to the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan or any of that, but they were very much cooperative partners in terms of the overarching war on terror, such as it was, and is, I guess, technically. But that partnership, that cooperation on economic matters, on security matters, and also defense industrial base, that's another thing. You know, the Saudis spend a lot of their petrodollars, technically. They spend a lot of their revenue on military equipment that they don't necessarily need, but they do it out of interest, out of deference, so to speak, to the relationship with the United States. And if the United States did break that relationship, a lot of that money would go to other producers, you know, possibly Russia, China, you know, whomever. And that's money that comes out of the pocket of the defense base here in the United States. And we've talked a little bit before about how trying to maintain capacity in defense industries is kind of a running concern, because if you're not producing at a pretty steady pace, at least at a minimal pace, then you start losing skill sets. And if you lose skill sets, it can be hard to get them back if there's an emergency later on. So the Saudis are able to help with that by contributing some of those petrodollars. So that's kind of what Trump himself was talking about when he was talking about this. He mentioned specifically that you know, if the United States didn't sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, then they would just buy them from somebody else. So a weapons sanction would not be effective, one, but would also hurt the United States more than it would the Saudis, since they would just spend the money elsewhere. So that's a rough, quick overview of this journalist assassination affair. I think his name is Khashoggi.
Yeah. Another thing that is it's a meme at this point, in addition to being like a historical trend, is that being a journalist tends to be one of the most dangerous jobs you could possibly have.
Yeah.
Just because the transfer of information about especially key stuff that's happening and how that can shape public opinion and whatnot, it's a big aspect of power that journalists have that is very disproportionate oftentimes to how much they get paid. Like, they have a lot of political swing by being a journalist, even though it's a fairly modest profession in terms of newspapers and getting people what's happening in the world and that kind of thing. But yeah, you can upset some people quite a bit if you know some stuff that they don't want you to know.
Yeah, it's been getting more dangerous. There's been a trend in that direction. It's getting harder. There's been several, actually, over the past year, high-profile assassinations. There was Malta, where there was a woman who was, I think, a blogger. I want to say she was a blogger, and she did anti-corruption investigations, and she found some evidence that there was a link between the government in power at the time, maybe the Prime Minister himself, and some nefarious, you know, actors of one sort or another. And she ended up assassinated. I think she was shot? No, it was a car bomb, I think. I think she was killed in a car bomb. Not like a suicide bombing, just they put a bomb in her car. It's an old-style mafia thing. You know, they put a bomb in her car, she started it, and it blew up with her in it. Mm-hmm. And then there was a shooting in Slovakia. I think that was earlier this year, where there was a man who was investigating links between the government and the Casa Nostra, the Italian mafia. And he ended up dead. They found his body and his, I think, wife's body? Or was it his wife, a girlfriend? I don't know. His partner, let's say. They were found shot to death in their home, I think. And so that led to a huge outcry and protest in Slovakia, you know, anti-corruption protests, that sort of thing. And I think recently there was kind of one in Bulgaria? maybe it was Romania. I think we've got some Balkans people listening. You know, you guys can keep me honest on it. This might be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything we talk about. You know, have a stronger background in some areas than other, more foreign policy, economics. But some of this stuff is stuff I've just read about. So, you know, if I say something stupid, ignorant, biased, or wrong, what have you, I'm definitely encourage chat to correct me and to participate in chat. You know, I don't read the chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will see the comments when I kind of go back.
There's a fun Orwell, it's a paraphrased quote that they put in the chat that's relevant to this. Journalism is publishing things powerful people don't want you to publish. Everything else is public relations.
Yeah, that's pretty true. Especially now. You know, a lot of journalism now is basically cutting and pasting statements from, you know, official functions. You know, the White House spokesman coming out and doing a press conference. Just take the quotes, put them in the paper. You know, there'll be reports released from the think tanks affiliated with the parties, and, you know, in some countries with the government itself. Yeah, there's a lot of cut and paste journalism in the modern era. The investigative stuff is expensive, it's uncertain. It doesn't always even go anywhere. That's another big problem. You can spend a lot of time and resources on an investigation and then basically end up with nothing, and then all that time went to waste. You know, then what do you do? It was more practical before, decades ago, when you could kind of get away with that. You know, newspapers were not as pressed to return high profits. They could kind of afford to spend more time on things that didn't always return a good story that could catch readers. But now that the market is so competitive, the newspapers lose so much money, they just don't really have the resources or the incentive to do that as much. So it kind of falls more to, you know, what would you call them? Crowdsourced information outlets, crowdsourced news outlets to kind of do that investigative stuff. That seems to be the direction it's going in anyway. I don't know if that's going to be workable in the long run, though. But yeah, it's getting very dangerous. Romania or Bulgaria, I can't remember. It was the one where the female journalist who did anti-corruption stuff, I think she did anti-corruption stuff, was found dead in a park. But I think the police also found that she had been raped and that it wasn't a assassination, that it was just a basically murderous rapist. Mm-hmm. And I think they did catch him. I think they tracked him back to Germany and they were able to arrest him.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that makes you raise an eyebrow, though. If it's a person of interest who has something bad happen to them, yeah. It's like, well, that's awfully convenient for the people who didn't like what she was releasing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's many an eyebrow was raised in that vein, for sure. And so that's why it kind of got a much higher profile in the international news than it might otherwise have gotten.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, anti-corruption is a big deal in Eastern Europe still. We've still got a ways to go, especially in the Balkans, so people pay a lot of attention to that. They're very sensitive.
We got one of the usual kind of questions in the chat talking about, are there any news sources and journalists who aren't biased anymore? And we've talked a lot about how basically everyone has a bias. The key to being a good consumer of information is identifying what the bias of the publisher is and factoring that into the way that you're interpreting the information presented. Mm-hmm. Like, you can have stuff that is closer or further from neutral, but once you know what that is, you can kind of... It's basically kind of like balancing a chemical equation, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. Where it's like, you could have a Fox News article, for example, and you know what their slant is, and you kind of take that and cancel out whatever stuff is slanted that they put in it, and then oftentimes you still have some legitimate story left over that counts as news that you can browse and whatnot.
Yeah, there's no such thing as an unbiased source. Everyone has bias. Some outlets are better than others at trying to address it, but it's always there. So there's no one place you can go. In general, it's better to try multiple sources and to try to learn as much about the underlying topic in question being reported on, so that you can kind of judge for yourself the veracity of the reporting. Mm-hmm. I mean, in general, the best rule of thumb is skepticism. Just be skeptical, ask questions, do background research, etc.
I'm skeptical of you telling me to be skeptical.
I don't doubt that there's more than a few people who would think that, too. There's probably a lot of people who assume some ulterior motive to anyone telling them to be skeptical. Well, why should I be skeptical about my preferred source? I think they're telling the truth. What are you up to telling me to be skeptical?
Yeah, but this news anchor is so good looking and well spoken. They must be right.
Yeah, that's a real phenomenon. No, just you can't be skeptical just completely, and you can't do background research with every single news story you read. But just in general, you don't have to walk away from every news story. Well, you don't have to walk into every article you read or news story you see with it thinking of it as a life and death ideological battle between your existing beliefs and a potential competing set of beliefs. It's perfectly acceptable to walk out of an article or news story thinking, okay, that makes me ask questions, but I'm still uncertain. I should look into that later. Uncertainty is a perfectly valid state of mind. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to religiously believe in something. So healthy skepticism is encouraged in that vein. That's probably the best advice I could give on that going.
But you can.
True. So before we get into the... well, I guess I should ask you, was there anything else that you wanted to get into?
That was kind of the really, really, really noisy one over the past few weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can't really think of anything else right now. There's the Lingbane War happening.
Sorry. All right. Well, then I'll dig into questions here. But before I do, I wanted to do one quick note. The last time we were on, I mentioned that we talked a little bit about the Revolutionary War here in North America. And I talked about how 13 colonies, how certain British colonies in North America did not participate in the Revolutionary War, and how if they did, the United States would have been much larger upon the war's end. And I mentioned that the colony of Florida had not joined the 13 colonies in the revolt and remained loyal to Britain, and somebody expressed some skepticism about that. They had not thought that Florida had been a British colony. And they're half right. At the time, during the Revolutionary War, Florida actually was a British colony. But this person is also right that for most of Florida's history before joining the United States, it had been a Spanish colony. Basically, it was originally a Spanish colony starting in the 1500s. I think St. Augustine was the first Spanish colony in Florida. And then it stayed Spanish up until the end of the 7 Years' War, which I think ended in like 1760-something, 63, let's say. And as part of the settlement that ended the 7 Years' War, Florida changed hands. Basically, it went from being a Spanish colony to a British colony. And so it remained a British colony from 1763 up until the end of the Revolutionary War in 1782, I want to say. You know, somebody with a better memory than me can keep me straight on the exact years. But it stayed a British colony up until the end of the Revolutionary War, when the British, at the end of that war, handed it back to the Spanish as part of the peace treaty that ended that conflict. So for most of Florida's history, it was a Spanish colony, but there was a period of a couple decades there, specifically during the Revolutionary, including during the Revolutionary War, when it was actually a British colony. So just wanted to clear that up real quick. Interesting bit of trivia. You know, for those not familiar with Florida's history, it hasn't always been crazy people getting arrested. Let's see. So the first question we had was thoughts on Trump's commitment to pull out of the nuclear treaty with Russia. Yeah, that was some new news from the past day or two. It's called the INF Treaty, and I don't think I can remember off the top of my head what that means. I think it's Intermediate Nuclear something Forces Treaty. Oh wait, actually somebody has it here. Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Thank you. Yeah, it's an old treaty from, I want to say, the late 80s. And the idea was to restrict development of nuclear weapons, or perhaps more accurately, nuclear-tipped weapons, specifically missiles, that had a range of basically between 500 miles and, I want to say, like 1,000 plus miles. And anything less than that was fine, which is why we have cruise missiles still. But anything over that was restricted. And, you know, both Russia and the United States pretty much adhered to that up until maybe the early aughts or so. Now, supposedly the Russians started developing a intermediate range cruise missile that did basically have a range that breached the terms of the treaty. And it was a tactical nuclear missile. We've talked before about how Russia is kind of dependent on tactical nuclear weapons, and so they tend to be very averse to any potential disarmament restrictions that might impact tactical nukes. Technically, Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons overall, but a disproportionate number of them are tactical in nature, specifically to make up for the fact that the Russian government has limited resources with which to protect a very large country. You know, they have a lot of territory to patrol and not a lot to do it with. So tactical nukes are kind of meant to make up the difference.
There is one thing to add as a note there with Russia and the size of the country, is when we look at a map of the world, the actual area of land is a little bit skewed depending on how close you are to one of the poles. So Russia, Canada, Greenland, a lot of the northern countries appear much larger on the map than they actually are. So there are a couple of maps that were posted to Reddit in the past couple weeks that showed that difference in size of Russia looks completely massive, and it is very large, but it's a little bit magnified just by virtue of that phenomenon. I forget the name of the effect. Maybe someone in chat can remind us what it is.
I know what you mean, but I don't remember the name of the effect either. It has to do with curvature of the Earth and the fact that it kind of tightens up near the top there. There's a website called thetruesize.com, and they do a good job of kind of illustrating those size differences, like what you're talking about. Russia is actually not as big as it looks on certain types of maps. There are different ways, what are called projections.
Mercator projection.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the one that generally makes Russia look particularly huge. There are many different ways to, many different map projections that you can use to try to create a world map. And it's basically impossible to create a square, flat, 2D map of the world that is actually accurate because of curvature of the Earth. I think there is one that is relatively accurate, but it looks very weird. It kind of cuts the map up into these weird shapes. I can't remember what it's called, but it's very distinctive. But Russia isn't necessarily as big as you think it is, but still quite huge.
Yeah. And a lot of it is Siberia, which, enjoy.
Well, there's a lot of variance there. I think, in fact, we might have there's a city in Siberia called, I want to say, Novosibirsk, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, so if you're Russian, please correct me on that. But we probably, in so much as we have some Russians listening, we might have a few from there right now, because that's kind of, if I'm remembering correctly, it's a university city. And so there tends to be a disproportionate number of students there. And so I suspect that a disproportionate number of Russians on the internet probably are either from there or one of the big Western cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. So if you're a Russian listening and you're from Novosibirsk, let us know, or tell me how wrong I am. Either way, I would want to know.
Yeah, we got like a 300 viewer host from a Russian streamer earlier, so I would guess we have a massively disproportionate amount of Russian viewers right now.
Oh, nice. Thank you for listening. Let me see if I can... 6. We have our little country chart down here. So it looks like we've got about 6, so welcome to stream.
It is pretty late there, I guess. Здравствуйте!
Let's see, what was I on about? Oh, the INF Treaty. Yeah, so basically the Russians have been developing missiles that the United States believes are in violation of the treaty. The Russians probably see it as perfectly legitimate because they need the tactical weapons, at least from their perspective. So there's been some tension there for a number of years. The Trump administration is just kind of acting on it. The Obama administration complained about it and tried to put pressure on them, but nothing ever really came of it. And there's also another factor that's kind of at play here, which is that the Chinese government has been developing them and is not a signatory to the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty was a bilateral treaty between Russia and the United States, so the Chinese are not at all bound by that. So with the Chinese government developing intermediate missiles, intermediate ranged missiles, the United States government kind of was feeling the pressure a bit, kind of felt like it was falling behind. So there was a desire to try to scrap the treaty to try to keep up with the Chinese government as well. So that's another factor to keep in mind. Beyond that, I don't know that it'll be that significant. You know, treaties sometimes die pretty natural deaths. You know, the circumstances in which they were negotiated kind of change or disappear entirely by are replaced entirely with new circumstances. So, in those cases, generally the treaties are modified or dropped. It's not that unusual. So, an arms race in the Pacific, to a degree, in terms of intermediate range missiles between China and the United States, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a Russian desire to push for intermediate range missiles kind of together into the treaty, basically. But everybody's doing pretty much exactly what they were doing before. I mean, even the United States probably partly adhered to the treaty just because it didn't really have much need to invest in intermediate range missiles. You know, the United States has the ability to project force just about anywhere in the world, so, you know, if you can only have 500-mile ranged missiles, then it's not hard for the United States to get within 500 miles of just about anywhere on Earth and use them. So it's no real skin off the back of the U.S. military to operate with that restriction. But it is something of a disadvantage if another major power develops a lot of them. A lot of intermediate range missiles, and the United States doesn't have any. So in that sense, there is kind of logic to it, to leaving the treaty and developing the systems. So let's see, what is your opinion on the news that Matisse may be leaving the Trump administration and that the Trump admin will be removing us from the INF treaty between us and Russia? Is the Cold War ramping up again, or is this likely all mind games? I think it would be unfortunate if Matisse left, because he's been a kind of security blanket for people who are critical of, who are suspicious of Trump's soundness of mind, shall we say. Matisse has been kind of perceived by people outside of the administration as a quote-unquote adult in the room, as someone who can kind of rein in the president's most egregious impulses, most elaborate, extravagant impulses. So if he leaves, that could create a, not a crisis, but there could be a significant questions raised on parts of critics of the administration as to whether or not, oh, thank you, Matisse, whether or not Mattis can, or whether or not the administration's worst impulses will be contained. I'm never going to get it. Mattis. Is that what it is? I don't know. I'm terrible at pronunciations.
I have no idea.
That's a running theme on here since the first day. It's what happens when you don't talk to people.
Reading is fun, but it doesn't help you pronounce.
No, it doesn't, unfortunately. But yeah, that would be the principal concern as far as Mr. Mattis, whoever he is.
You could also say, what's his butt?
What's his butt? Let's go with that. Secretary of Defense, what's his butt?
There's a nice ring to it.
But beyond that, I don't know how much I would really worry about it. I mean, I don't know how much he's really been able to kind of rein in the president, and I think whoever replaces him would probably play a similar role. And I think, I want to say that the Secretary of Defense is one of the positions that has to be voted on by the Senate. Somebody can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But if that's correct, then there is a kind of firewall there. You know, he can't just appoint some, you know, crazed clown who wants to nuke the world. He's going to have to appoint somebody acceptable to the Senate, assuming, again, that I'm remembering that right anyway. If not, then maybe more of a problem, but I'm not really worried about it right now. We'll see. We'll see how it plays out going forward. But as for removing us from the INF Treaty, yeah, basically what I just said. Is the Cold War ramping up again, or is this likely all mind games? There is no Cold War, for sure. Definitely not one between Russia and the United States. I mean, the Cold War was very much an ideological struggle. It was very much authoritarian socialism versus democratic capitalism. And in that sense, there was a lot of kind of underlying tension in a lot of countries around the world, through which the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union kind of intertwined with. You know, nationalist movements in the developing world sort of got enmeshed in that ideological struggle. So there was a sense that there was a world competition for influence, you know, a kind of jockeying for power between these two superpowers. There's nothing like that really happening now. You know, Russia mostly thinks, anyway, the Russian government thinks that it's competing for its near abroad, for its sphere of influence around Russia, but they're not really competing for world influence. You know, they'll throw a monkey wrench in here or there where they can find a way to, but mostly that's just about getting some leverage. It's not really an overarching conflict, an overarching competition with the United States for the soul, so to speak, of the world. I would argue there's not even a Cold War with the China, and probably won't be. You know, the Chinese are not interested in being, you know, a replacement for the Soviet Union. They don't want to be a revolutionary force in the world. In fact, really the United States at this point is more the revolutionary force. It's more the United States that has been pressuring countries to adhere to international norms and has, over the course of the past few decades, overturned a couple of governments, at least. So we're kind of the ones who are pushing people to be different, to be, in the opinion of the United States, to be better. They're trying to improve countries, or at least get them to adhere, at least nominally, to international norms. The Chinese government, in contrast, is very, very conservative. They don't want to rock the boat. You know, we've talked about it before, but, you know, just to kind of summarize, the Communist Party of China has its hands full trying to govern 1 billion plus Chinese. They don't need more problems. And that's what they would get by trying to move outside of China and trying to play a big role in the world like the Soviets did or the United States does. Their principal foreign policy goals are generally self-serving and economic. You know, they want markets for their producers, they want support for their state-owned enterprises, you know, they want outlets for their loans, things like that. It's not really an ideological struggle. They're not attempting to build a grand alliance of anti-Westerners. They will work with other countries in so much as doing so undermines international norms that are designed to pressure authoritarian regimes specifically. You know, there is a desire to implement international norms that are more befitting of authoritarians. In other words, norms that do not facilitate intervention or criticism even, or at least significant criticism of other nations. There's a strong desire for sovereignty overall, basically, a strong desire to have sovereignty be enshrined as the principal value in international relations, and that other nations should not concern themselves with the internal affairs of other states. So that's more what China wants to do when it cooperates with other states, in so much as it has in order to undermine present international norms. Well, that specific international norm anyway. So I don't think there's going to be a Cold War there, and I don't think there's one now. You know, I mean, at most you could say there's a trade war, and it's not even much of a trade war, really. You know, it used to be trade wars were thorough. You know, they were real trade wars back in the early 20th century were about politicians trying to cater to specific voting blocs in their countries, specific voters who wanted protection from foreign competition. It was very much realpolitik in that sense. It was driven by domestic political considerations. This trade war is not really, well, at least not entirely driven by such considerations. I mean, it used to be people would say free trade is bad, we need to protect our markets. Now it's more, we need free trade, and what we have now is not free trade. You know, it's more a characterization of the status quo as unfair trade. So now what the Trump administration is technically doing is pushing for free trade, because they don't think what they have now is free trade. That's a very different context to what happened in the early 20th century when people said, oh, we have fair trade, we just don't want it. we don't want free trade at all. We think it's bad for the economy, and we want protections so that we can have more jobs for our people. So in that sense, this current trade war is more of a quasi-trade war. It's more of a trade dispute more than anything. And I think I was, and it really comes almost down to political systems. I was talking about this yesterday with a friend, actually. The underlying tension between the United States and China in this trade dispute they're having comes down to their differing political systems. Fundamentally, obviously there's a lot of different factors, but I'm being reductivist here, which is, you know, maybe not a great thing, but hear me out. Let me just kind of get this out, and people can kind of judge it for themselves. But this is shower thoughts from John Smith, basically, at this point. But in the Chinese political system, the Chinese government has not only direct power over people, companies, the economy, etc. It has indirect power. The United States has direct power also, in the sense it has the normal, avenues through which the government can exert power over the economy and people. But there are restrictions, and it's a transparent process, basically, for the most part. But in China, it's not transparent, and they have a lot of mechanisms that are sort of underground. The Communist Party of China has basically spread its tentacles all over Chinese society in one way or the other. So what that means then is that the Chinese government can promise to do things like improve property rights protection, to mitigate or eliminate entirely local partnership requirements, or clamp down on basically mandatory tech transfer requirements. Those are kind of more implicit. But the government of China can promise to deliver on those things, to deal with those things in order to alleviate pressure from the United States. But how would you verify that they were actually doing that? Because even if the government of China does that, the Communist Party of China could use its indirect influence on companies, on people, on society, etc., to push them to behave in a way that is correspondent with the de facto continuation of those policies. So maybe there is no rule or law that says you have to partner with a local producer to succeed, but maybe the party forces, or threatens, more accurately, local Chinese companies, basically threatens them into not partnering with foreign producers. Well, that's not what I want either. Can threaten consumers into not buying from foreign producers in China if they do not have a local partner. Hypothetically, that is something that they could do, such that a foreign producer that did not have a local partner could not succeed. And they can also pressure potential suppliers not to supply that company, and it can operate up and down the supply line, the supply chain rather, such that they can exert influence in that vein. Again, indirectly. So if that happens, and if the foreign company complained, the Chinese government could say, hey, we have no rule that says you have to partner with anybody. If you're failing, it's just because you can't hack it in our market. You're not competitive enough. Your prices aren't good enough. You're not good enough. You're not a competitive firm. And so, in turn, a company that did partner with a local Chinese firm might not face those barriers and would then succeed. And so then the Chinese government could say again, hey, that was the smart thing to do. We didn't have anything to do with it. That just speaks to the fact that having a local partner was a good idea all along, even without the rule in place. So again, this is just trying to illustrate this overarching point. How do you actually verify that Chinese authorities actually have actually changed that rule, given that they could continue to enforce it covertly with that indirect power that the Communist Party of China has in Chinese society? The United States, in turn, faces a dilemma, because hypothetically it could negotiate such concessions from China, but if China agreed with them but could not credibly promise to actually enforce them, what then should the United States do if there is no substantive change in the performance of foreign companies in China? If U.S. producers do not see an uptick in profit from the concessions made by the Chinese government, because the Communist Party of China may or may not be de facto continuing those policies under the table, do we then break off the relationship? Or do you just kind of accept that as a necessary cost? Just the inherent cost of doing business with an authoritarian regime that has opaque institutions. It's a tough call, because it might be that they're not continuing to enforce those policies. It may be that if American companies, after concessions from the Chinese government, if U.S. companies still don't do well, it may just be that they're really not competitive, or maybe just Chinese consumers don't want the product they have, or something like that. How do you judge between that and Communist Party interference? In an opaque society, with opaque institutions like China, you kind of can't. It's very difficult to do. It's basically a judgment call. And so that fundamental difference makes concessions and negotiations inherently difficult. And for that reason, I don't really think that there's going to be a return to the status quo. I don't think there's anything that the Chinese government could promise with credibility that would really satisfy U.S. government concerns in the trading relationship. I suspect the most you could get is something like what was negotiated with the Japanese in the 80s, which is the Japanese agreed to two things come to mind that I'm remembering. Voluntary export quotas, specifically for their automotive companies, and then also they agreed to purchase a certain amount of U.S. goods to basically open their market to more U.S. goods, which ended up being bullshit. They bought U.S. semiconductors. Semiconductors was the other big industry. Automotive was one. Semiconductor industry was the other that people were concerned about because Japanese semiconductor producers were eating up market share very rapidly at the time. So the Japanese government negotiated an agreement where they would agree to buy, or rather Japanese firms would agree to buy semiconductors. And you can't really force firms to buy, but Japanese corporations had very tight relations with the Japanese government. So given Japanese industrial policy, Tokyo actually kind of did have the tools to lean on them to buy those semiconductors. But they actually just threw them into Tokyo Bay because they didn't need them. They were buying Japanese semiconductors. So basically, that agreement ended up being a de facto transfer. The Japanese government basically said, all right, we'll pay your semiconductors X amount of money in exchange for the right to continue producing our semiconductors. And so that was that basically just ended up being a de facto transfer. So that could be something that could be replicated here. It may be that China agrees to voluntary export quotas with regard to certain sensitive industries, specifically things that they are accused of dumping, like solar panels or steel or what have you. And they may also agree to basically de facto transfer money to certain American producers to just buy certain American goods and then dump them in the South China Sea or whatever they see fit to do with them. But that doesn't solve that fundamental problem that I mentioned. But in order to resolve that, the Chinese would have to change their legal system to be transparent, and I don't think anybody expects the Communist Party of China to be willing to do that. And they would also have to give up their industrial policy, and we've talked a lot before about Chinese industrial policy, so basically they're not going to give that up because they see that as a critical part of their development strategy. China is still technically a developing country, and there are still millions and millions of Chinese people who are very poor. And the Chinese government does not think that they can afford to abandon their industrial policy because they see it as necessary to shifting China's economy into developed status, to making it a developed economy. So for those reasons, they're not going to give those things up, and because they're not going to give those things up, the trading relationship cannot really continue as is, and there's going to be either a breakdown in the trading relationship completely or some superficial token concessions like the ones I was just talking about. But that fundamental difference there is kind of the key thing. That's the key difference that's going to be the sticking point of negotiations going forward. And how the negotiations play out is going to center around how the United States government and the Chinese government kind of dance around that fundamental difference, that lack of transparent institutions in China. Sorry, that was a wild-ass tangent, wasn't it?
Wild-ass tangents are fun. That's why we're here.
Yeah. That was a spin-off of is the Cold War ramping up again, or is this likely all mind games? It's not a Cold War. Probably just, I guess, mind games. If I have to choose between the two, it's just diplomatic maneuvering. Any chance the Senate makes effort to push Trump on this matter, Saudi assassination of the journalist? They've been making noises to that effect. I think the Senate will probably push for limited sanctions of some kind, but it'll probably be in a sector that doesn't matter. They'll basically just be token sanctions. There was I don't know what it'll be like, pencils or something, something stupid. They'll probably paint it as a big deal. They'll say strategic resources, and then they'll just sort of, in the fine print, say pencils. Some dumb shit like that. It's diplomacy is all about song and dance. It's very much kabuki theater.
Pencils aren't dumb, dude. You need those to write.
You do.
Unless you have pens.
Shit. You got me. You found the loophole. Curses. Yeah, I don't think they'll do anything substantive, but I do expect them to do something. There is a sense that this is not something that should be allowed to go unaddressed. There is a desire to enforce, at least nominally, international norms of behavior that protect the freedom of journalists to not be dismembered in an embassy. But given the strategic context, the geopolitical circumstances and whatnot, I don't think it'll mean much substantively. I don't think they'll really hurt Saudi Arabia that much. That doesn't mean it's not important. You know, symbolic action still has value in so much as it sets a precedent. Like if later on you actually do want to do something substantive, the Saudis would not be able to say, oh, hey, you didn't do anything before, so how can you do anything now? Well, we did do something before, it just was mostly symbolic, but technically it was something, so it's not unprecedented to do something later on that is substantive. So it is important in that sense to have at least some symbolic action to try to address the issue. But I would be very surprised if they did anything more than superficial. Or they could do something substantive but put a time limit on it. They could be like, okay, we're not going to sell you XYZ for 6 months. And then the Saudis just kind of shrug and say, okay, see you in 6 months. Let's see. Excuse me, sorry. With the midterms upcoming, can you talk about how much of the voting system is based on the Constitution and how much states have a say on the issue? Can states make their own laws on federal elections with regards to a plurality system, electoral system, campaign financing, party affiliation, and so on without violating the Constitution? If I remember correctly, and maybe somebody more familiar with the Constitution in chat can kind of correct me on this if I'm wrong, I hope they can. But I believe that when it comes to federal elections, it is in the power of the states to decide how those play out. So hypothetically, if you wanted to allocate your seats and your state's seats in the House of Representatives with a representative electoral system, a state could do that. That would technically be fine, I think. Actually, that might not be fine. I think that did go to the Supreme Court. But nominally, states do have that power. The representative thing, that went to the Supreme Court because of racism, basically. It was believed that state shifting might try to shift to a representative system to try to take votes away from African Americans in the South. So I think technically federal courts did rule that you can't quite do that. I don't remember the specifics of the court case, but something to that effect. But beyond civil rights legislation, technically the states do have the right to decide how they vote on their federal representatives. So yes, they can make their own laws on federal elections with regard to electoral system plurality. And I think they can also make their own rules on campaign financing. I might be wrong on that though, because I know the feds regulate or used to regulate the presidential elections, but I don't know if they also did that, if that legislation extended to the Senate and House. And I'll wager somebody in chat does know that, so they would know better than me. So I'll defer to chat on that. But as far as I know, maybe on the campaign financing. I'm not sure on what the difference is between. For sure, the states have campaign finance rules on their own statewide elections, but I'm not sure how they relate to federal elections. That might be federal law there. And then party affiliation. Every state has its own rules on requirements for what party can be on the ballot. You know, I think you have to get X amount of signatures in order to get on the ballot. A given party, that is, has to, and probably also independent candidates. That's one of the barriers to entry for new political parties. It's actually expensive and difficult if you're a new political party to get on a ballot for the first time. You know, you're kind of unknown, and people generally have a very laissez, kind of disregard third parties here in the United States. That there is a practical side to that, because in the United States, generally, political movements get absorbed by one major political party or the other. And that takes the wind out of the sails of third parties as a result. You know, you may find that there's a lot of support for a libertarian third party, let's say. That's a half joke, since that's... If you've ever followed the Libertarian Party, it's a bit of a circus. But let's say, hypothetically, there were a big upsurge in libertarian sentiment in the United States. And that there was a lot of votes there to be had by a potential Libertarian Party. The most likely outcome is not that a Libertarian Party then starts succeeding at the polls. The most likely outcome is that either the Republican or Democratic Party changes their platform to try to attract those votes, probably the Republican Party, given that they're more conservative. So that would take votes away from that new Libertarian Party, and they would relegate it. And in turn, the new Republican representative, if they did indeed win office, would try to represent that libertarian sentiment in their policy decision-making. Generally, that's how it works. But that's an example of barriers to entry for new parties. And party affiliation rules are, I think, set at the state level in that sense. So, let me see. I think I addressed all of the question, Ken states. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. That may not be as much detail as you wanted, but that's what I'm remembering off the top of my head. Yeah, it's a very... The United States is a very decentralized political system. It has a very decentralized political system, rather. As much power has been vested in the states as is technically possible. Nominally, the Constitution is written such that any powers not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution are technically supposed to be state powers. So basically, the Constitution says what the federal government can do, and then everything else is supposed to be states. That's a default assumption. That's kind of been undermined over time because of reinterpretation of certain clauses of the Constitution, specifically the Commerce Clause in particular being the case in point. You know, there was a sense that the federal government would have to have the power to regulate commerce between states to prevent states from competing with each other economically. But then that evolved over time to give the federal government greater and greater power to regulate the overarching economy, because so many new industries over the course of industrialization and, you know, especially over the past few decades, have resulted in businesses that are kind of ambiguously interstate in their nature. You know, it's kind of hard to find a business that's a large business anyway that's just located in one state. You know, the spatial bounds of business have been broken over the past century. So in turn, because business is now almost inherently interstate, the federal government's power to regulate commerce has been interpreted to give it kind of broad regulatory power that it was not necessarily intended to have originally. That's kind of an ongoing debate in and of itself. But technically, the states are supposed to have most of the power, and with regard to voting in representatives to the federal government, I think they do mostly have discretionary power in how they do that. That's a rough and dirty answer, though. If you're really looking for something in depth, I would encourage you to go further. But if you're looking for a quick and dirty answer, I can give you that. Let's see. If nobody else asked yet, what do you think about the report and responses to the Bloomberg China hack story? Actually, I did see that. I found that very interesting. That's been a very bizarre story, actually. Have you heard of that, Neuro?
No. What is that?
So Bloomberg, a news outlet, basically, released a story in which they said that they had done, it was supposedly an investigation, and they contacted people in the government and they claim contacted people in different companies and whatnot. And according to what they found, certain, and I don't think I can remember which the exact equipment, but I think it was like a chip or something, a component in servers that had been imported from China was found to have been tampered with. And there was some device added to it, or the device itself had been modified such that there was information being redirected and being harvested by actors of some kind. It was inferred that it was the Chinese government doing it. So that was a big... Bloomberg said that those devices had been found amongst a number of governments, agencies that were being used by government agencies and different companies, and had been sold by large American corporations. I want to say Apple was one of them, but that doesn't sound right. Somebody in chat might be able to remember the specific large companies that they pointed the finger at, but basically the gist of it was that Bloomberg claims to have found that the Chinese government or Chinese actors of some kind tampered with hardware imported from China as part of an intelligence gathering operation. And if true, that would be a significant escalation in economic espionage, corporate espionage, if you like. as engaged in by allegedly the Chinese actors, and that would be that's a big step above just hacking, because hacking is all software for the most part. At
Chad
least,
is saying yes, Apple.
Apple, okay, it was Apple. But actually hacking hardware, actually modifying the hardware itself is a pretty significant escalation. And that would raise a lot of questions about how much you can actually trust Chinese hardware producers. So beyond the implications for the national security relationship between the United States and China, there's also the issue of the credibility and trustworthiness of those economic actors in China itself. Every economic actor is under suspicion in any country because its government can't influence it. Most governments are too weak to really do that or to want to do it. The United States obviously has the power to do that, but for the most part, the United States is transparent, so there's relatively more trust for U.S. companies, because while the U.S. government can and does push them to do things that are not always in their interest, we do have constitutional rule of law here, such that the government does not assume to really abuse that power, at least not too much. In contrast, China's opaque political system means that there's more mistrust cast on Chinese producers. There's a sense that if the Chinese government really wanted to, it could force them to act as de facto extensions of Chinese intelligence agencies. Now, up till now, as far as I know, there hasn't really been any significant examples of Chinese companies modifying hardware in this way. So if this is true, this would be a major problem for Chinese producers, because there's going to be significantly more doubt then cast on Chinese producers and their independence going forward. If you're an American producer or redistributor, you don't want to sell goods that are going to get you into trouble, and it may be that goods that are basically spy devices for a foreign power are probably going to get you in trouble, either with consumers, if not the government itself. So that may itself result in a redistribution of the supply chain away from China purely for market reasons, because of that damage to trust. We've talked before about how important trust is in economics and business, etc. Trust, uncertainty, risk management, those are all sort of the hidden prices in business. So the reason I keep saying alleged, it might have happened, there's more to the story than just that, because the government, well, not the government actually, but the companies involved, Apple and the other companies that Bloomberg asserted had sold these devices or were using these devices, claimed that the story is not true. And they've demanded that Bloomberg retract the story. Now, as far as I know, the government of the United States hasn't, I don't think, commented on it. They're kind of staying out of it. But supposedly Bloomberg contacted people in the government, and they were among the sources. So there is a question also about the veracity of the story, because the big players involved are denying it, basically. They say it never happened.
That seems like a very kind of legalese adult way of saying nuh-uh. Nuh-uh.
Pretty much, yeah. That's what they would say. Yeah, my throat is okay. I'm just you talk for a while, it gets a little dry. Sorry, that's Mas Prototype sent me a message thing there. Yeah, that's wait, what were we talking about?
Nuh-uh.
Oh, right.
Bloomberg.
Yeah, if it's true, then they would deny it, because that, it's not just damaging for Chinese producers, it also casts doubt on them. So they don't want to damage their businesses' reputations either. But on the other hand, maybe it's just not true. Maybe it's the U.S. government trying to damage Chinese producers as part of the overarching trade dispute that they're having. So who's right, who's telling the truth, it's not really immediately clear. But, like I said, if it is true, there could be significant implications there for not only relations between China and the U.S., but specifically market relations between U.S. companies and Chinese companies. I was surprised that story didn't get more attention. I didn't really see much well, I guess I shouldn't say that. I don't really watch cable news anymore, so maybe it did get attention and I just don't know. But those are some thoughts on that. What is the future of German conservatism given its decline over the last 13 years? Interesting question. For those who don't know, for those who don't follow German politics has been pretty much dominated in one form or another for much of the past 10 plus years by Angela Merkel and the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union. I think that's what it's called, which is basically the dominant conservative political party in Germany. And for much of that time, they've actually governed in a coalition with the predominant center-left political party in Germany called the SPD. I think it's called the SPD. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And over that time, there's been growing pressure on not just the conservative, not just the CDU, but also the SPD. You know, basically, that's just part of the fringes of the political spectrum, kind of growing and putting more and more pressure on establishment political parties. But there has been a lot of pressure on center-right conservatism in particular, but there's a sense that it's not doing enough to redistribute the gains and success of the German economy to the workers. That's the leftist position, and then the far-right position is that the government hasn't been doing enough to preserve German culture in the face of an onslaught of immigrants. So pressure from both ends in that sense, and German conservatism, some have speculated, is kind of nearing its end game. It won't disappear, but it may be that its days in power are kind of numbered at this point. And there have been a number of political crises, well, not crises, but let's say scandals, over the past year that have cast the current iteration of that center-left, center-right coalition into doubt. There was an issue with, I want to say, Germany's equivalent of the Secretary of Defense. Is that what it was? He was accused of having links with far-right groups, I think, or of having said some things that were a little bit too sympathetic to them. Something to that effect. I don't quite remember the details. I don't think it was all that big a deal internationally, but within Germany, I think it got a lot more attention. Please correct me on that, if anybody knows about that. But the bigger issue was the CSU, and I don't remember what CSU stands for exactly, but the CSU is a regional political party. And it's the dominant political party, not only the dominant political party, but the dominant conservative political party in the province of Bavaria. I think you guys have provinces in Germany, don't you? Or is it states? Correct me. You can correct me on that too. I'm not sure. Lots of things to correct me on tonight. But basically, Bavaria is, I think, the largest, province/state in Germany. And they have a lot of pride in being Bavarian. They have a strong identity. So they kind of have their own political party there that they vote for. And generally, the CDU and CSU are a part of a coalition at the national level. So that CDU-SPD coalition at the national level also actually includes the CSU. They're basically sister conservative parties. And because they're both conservative, they generally work together. But because Bavarians basically just want their own party, they don't vote for the CSU. They don't vote for the CDU, sorry. That's my impression, anyway. But recently, over the past year, the leader of the CSU has been trying to shift the party's platform to the right in order to try to deal with the threat posed by the AfD, which is a party called the Alternative for Germany, which is sort of a pseudo-far-right party. It didn't start as a far-right party, but it kind of evolved into one over time. And it's principally known for being anti-immigrant and Eurosceptic, if I'm remembering correctly. So the CSU kind of perceived that it was losing votes to that group, and so they started shifting the policy platform of the party to the right, and that created tensions with the CDU at the national level, because at the national level, the coalition between the CDU and SPD was coming under pressure for not doing enough to fight the far right, and the shift towards the far right that had been happening in Germany. So, again, pressure from both ends. So the CSU, as I recall, was given the Secretary of the Interior. I think that's what it's called in Germany. Basically, the internal security apparatus. And I think the head of the CSU was named Horst Seehofer? I don't quite remember, but I think it sounded like that anyway. But he was the guy who was given that department. And he basically publicly challenged Angela Merkel's leadership. And that created a lot of tensions between the CSU and CDU. And that led into Bavarian elections recently, relatively recently, and the result was that the CSU was punished severely. they lost a number of seats. They performed very badly, and I think it was mostly the AFD and the Green Party that picked up most of the slack. So basically the CSU was punished for trying to shift too far to the right in response to the AFD and the politics that it represented. And that put a severe strain, that whole episode, that whole series of events put a severe strain on the relationship between the two sister conservative parties, so to speak. So there's a sense then that the partnership between the CDU and CSU could be nearing the end of its shelf life. It may be nearing an end because there's too many fundamental differences there, and the CSU seems to be weakening. That's in addition to the pressure from the left on the SPD's part, where a lot of people who vote for the SPD think the SPD is destroying its legitimacy as a center-left party by working too much with conservative political forces. So they're facing leftist pressure. So the coalition seems to be facing impossible odds. In fact, it's surprising that Angela Merkel is still in office. It's a testament to her political acumen and the, well, not dysfunction, but discombobulation, shall we say, of German politics right now, that she's still in office. Kind of the only one who's kind of holding the circus together at this point. But sooner or later, something's got to give. There's a sense that this equilibrium cannot hold and that there's going to be a significant shift eventually. But it's not really clear what that would be. On the one hand, if the SPD leaves the coalition and forces an election, they would kind of preserve their legitimacy amongst leftist voters, but on the other hand, all that may do is empower extremist forces of one sort or another, because the SPD itself has been losing support because it is itself an establishment political party. So it may not really behoove it to really work with, or rather break up with the other establishment political party at the time, given that it's kind of the only other party it has a lot in common with. That's partly speculation on my part, but at this moment, everything is kind of in play. And there's been a lot of, basically, long story short, there's been a lot of pressure on conservative political parties in particular from the far right and the left in Germany. And there's a sense then that that's shrinking their power. To kind of get to the question, the future of German conservatism, it's still going to be there. It's still going to be a force. And I think the fact that the Alternative for Germany does as well as it does is testament to that fact. I think the question is, how and when does the immigration issue kind of finally resolve itself? It's already kind of on the decline, but once the immigration issue is settled satisfactorily, or rather to the satisfaction of all political groups involved in Germany, I think at that point the AfD kind of loses its appeal, because it had some appeal when it was mostly a Eurosceptic party during the Eurozone crisis, but it was mostly the immigration crisis that really brought in voters for the AfD. And once the immigration crisis kind of goes away, they kind of lose their raison d'etre. There's not as much meat there for them to kind of bring in voters. So once the AfD kind of starts to slide and immigration politics kind of wanes and people start focusing on other political issues, I suspect then that the CDU will start getting its voters back and will retain more, will regain some of its political clout. Now, whether or not there's a long-term trend towards leftist politics in Germany, that's another discussion. Certainly younger people tend to be more left-leaning, so in that sense the future is kind of the SPD's to lose. But on the other hand, as people get older, they tend to become more conservative. So in that sense, it may be that when the future finally does come, the SPD finds that it kind of lost its flock, so to speak. They kind of converted back over. Age has that effect on you. Once you get older, experience kind of has a way of changing the way you view things. That happens to everybody. That's not just a left to conservative thing. But that will probably happen. I don't think projections that inevitably Western politics, Germany, the US, etc., is inherently leftist. That's probably not true. I've heard that before and it didn't pan out. I don't expect it to be any more true in the future. People have a way of surprising you, especially over the long run. You never know what kind of wild shit happens in the long run. Nobody predicted Reagan and the moral majority in the 80s and in the 70s. People in the 70s thought the United States was screwed and that capitalism was on the way out, that this was the moment for socialism, and then a decade later it was the capitalist renaissance. So who the hell knows? But for now, I would say conservatives might be on the wane in the short to medium term, but over the long term, they'll probably still be a significant political force. once immigration politics dies down, I predict it'll probably, conservative liberal dynamics in Germany will probably, conservative leftist dynamics in Germany will probably return to something resembling the status quo from before the immigration and Eurozone crises. Now, I'm not an expert on Germany, so that's mostly just talking from what I've read in the news about Germany. So I'm by no means an expert in that vein. So I would certainly encourage any Germans listening, and I think we do have a few, from contributing their perspective and opinions and knowledge to that question and issue. And I would certainly be interested in hearing their firsthand opinions and accounts of the state of politics in Germany right now. Let's see. Would love to hear your thoughts on the upcoming midterms. Broad question. Okay, let me think for a minute. You know, my attitude towards the midterms have pretty much just been wait and see. Because there's a lot of close races. So it's kind of very much up in the air right now. In general, if you want a quick and dirty answer, a quick and dirty prediction, I suspect that the Republican Party will probably pick up a seat or two in the Senate, but will lose a number of seats in the House of Representatives. That would be my guess. And I say that because in the Senate, there's a lot of incumbent Democrats who are running in states that are pretty solidly pro-Trump. So I do not think that they're likely to win re-election. But that's an assumption on my part, and I haven't been watching the polls much. But I would infer that to be the case. In any case, it's hard. Generally, when you have one party has a lot of incumbents running, generally they lose seats. That's just, you know, historical data. So just in general, for that reason, I would expect the GOP to pick up a few. In the House of Representatives, generally the House kind of reflects more broader national sentiment about the political parties, and there's been a little bit of a shift away from the GOP. It had been bigger, but people started shifting back towards the GOP after the whole Kavanaugh thing. So it's not immediately clear just how some of those closer races will turn, but I would probably, again, if I had to guess, I would say the Democrats would pick up a number of seats there. So
the Kavanaugh thing was really embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for my country.
Well, you know, every country has its moments. Nobody's innocent. You know, I mean, laugh all you want, but I could very easily give a laundry list of colorful figures in European politics. There are plenty of Geert Wilders, Nigel Farages, and Salvinis in the world outside the United States, so you can't judge us. You can judge. It's fair. We do it all the time. More to the point. What do I think about the upcoming midterms? I guess to give a more expansive answer, you know, there's speculation about what will happen about after the midterms. If the Democrats do really well, there's a chance that they could push for impeachment of Donald Trump. I'm skeptical they'll do that. You know, I just don't know how much. I don't know if they'll have the votes, and even if they have the votes, I don't know if they'll have the political support to do it. But that's kind of an open question. I don't think it'll really be a priority in any case. I suspect that the Democratic Party would probably, if they did pick up a number of seats, would focus on one, shitting on Trump. That would probably be a daily thing. Two, probably economic issues and healthcare issues. That's kind of the meat for their base. They might do some token stuff on immigration, but that's sensitive, so I don't know how much of substance they would really be able to do. But I would expect them to push for healthcare reform of one sort or another, either probably mostly status quo stuff, probably trying to fight some of the stuff that the Trump administration has been doing with the administrative agencies and how they interpret some of the rules. So they might push back there. And there might be some attempt to do some, you know, what would you call it? What was it? Universal basic income. I don't think they'll pass that, but I think they'll talk about it and try to make it an issue so that they can run on it in 2020. So I would expect something in that vein. But given that they're probably not likely to have, even if they get a majority in the Senate, I don't think they'll have enough votes to really do anything big. Kind of like the GOP hasn't really had enough votes to do too much big. You know, they had their big tax cut, but beyond that, a lot of kind of minor stuff here and there. Now, on the other hand, if the GOP does really well, unexpectedly well, basically I would expect more of the same. What's his name? I think Mitch McConnell was making some noise about trying to tackle entitlement reform, you know, basically reforming Social Security, Medicare, etc. But I don't, you know, that's such a sensitive topic here in the United States, and there's so much resistance to any kind of significant reform. I doubt they would be able to do it. They could try, you know, but I suspect it would go about as well as the attempt to reform Obamacare. I don't know how many people remember that, but it didn't go very well for them. There was just too much resistance. Yeah, that pre-existing healthcare condition is really hard to work around. That's kind of the thing that's holding up major conservative reform of healthcare. There's a lot of things you can do, but it's really hard to get rid of that. But it's also hard to kind of move on keeping it. That's a whole other conversation we could get into, but basically, yeah, that didn't go anywhere, and I don't think entitlement reform will go anywhere for them. And if my predicted scenario is the right one, if the House goes Democratic but the Senate goes conservative, in that case, a lot of dysfunction. I would predict a lot of dysfunction and very little substantive legislating. Probably just a lot of gridlock. There might be some deal making. There's been more traction on the defense budget and infrastructure spending because the Trump administration is not really as concerned about the deficit and deficit spending. So that's kind of greased the wheels of the political system a little bit. That's helped kind of move things along a little more than in previous Congresses. But if there's a split between the Senate and the House like that, I don't know how much of that can continue. I would expect it to continue, but it won't accelerate. You know, people will go with the progress that's been made, but beyond that, I don't think the government will shut down again. But I think that there is a good chance that no substantive reform will happen over the next 2 years. Unless something bipartisan comes up or there's a big emergency that has bipartisan support. There might be some action there, but there's a very short list of things that have bipartisan support at this point, so I don't know how much of that they could really do. So those are some random thoughts. Not particularly well voiced or thought out, but you know, now you have them. Again, my principal position is wait and see, because it's really hard to make predictions at this point. There's a lot of close races, and you know, it's not even clear what kind of candidates you'll get. Just because a Democrat wins an election in the U.S. doesn't mean that they're going to be a liberal Democrat. That is to say, a leftist Democrat. There's lots of conservative Democrats, and there's lots of moderate Republicans, and so they don't always vote the way you think they will. So that's kind of what happened after the 2006 midterms. That was when Democrats really exploded. You know, they really took over the House and Senate, I think. I think they got control of both at that time. But a lot of the Democrats that won office at the time were conservative Democrats, relatively conservative Democrats, you know, Texas Democrats, basically, you know, pro-gun rights type people. And a lot of them got pushed out during the big 2010 purge. Yeah, there was a big backlash to the Obama administration and the attempt to reform the healthcare system with Obamacare, as it was called at the time. And that resulted in a lot of those conservative Democrats losing their seats to Tea Party Republicans, as they were called at the time. It seems like a long time ago that the Tea Party Republicans were a thing, but it's only been a few years since they were a force. Technically, they still are. I think the Freedom Caucus is still a big factor up there in Washington. But they've kind of been superseded at this point by the Trumpistas at this point. So we'll see what happens. I'm sure it'll be exciting. Let's see. So I'm sorry if that's not entirely satisfying, but again, it's just hard to make predictions at this point. So mostly, the most you can really get is speculation. You know, certainly close elections over the past few years have been nothing if not surprising. So I'm once bitten, twice shy. Let's put it like that. I'm not going to venture too far out into speculation, given how unpredictable elections have been. Let's see, the next question was, I've heard talk that if we cut arms sales to the Saudis, they'll buy from Russia instead. Considering the difficulty of shifting to different hardware and standards, how likely is that to actually happen? would they easily flip over any disruption in arms sales, or would it take a big push to send them to the Russians? I imagine they could do it pretty easily, because the Saudi military is not really meant to be used. It's not. Again, they depend mostly on the United States for their defense. Their military is almost a kind of token military. They've been using it more in Yemen lately, but that was a bit surprising, specifically because it had been seen as mostly a token military. So if it came down to it, yeah, they'll totally flip if they feel the need to. I don't think they're particularly wedded to the idea of having an American armed token military as opposed to a Russian armed token military. It may be that the Saudi government is trying to make it something other than a token military, but in that case, again, I still don't think they would care even then, because Saudis are profligate spenders. Mohammed bin Salman himself, I think, there was an old anecdote about him. He saw this really expensive yacht over in the Mediterranean, and he liked it, so he approached the buyer and just bought it on the spot. And it was like $1 billion yacht or something ridiculous like that. It was just hugely expensive. But they just kind of bought it. They were like, yeah, whatever. We have the money. Let's do it. So I don't think, they spend a lot more than $1 billion on arms from the United States, but I really don't think they'll give much of a shit if it's disruptive to switch to the Russians. Again, buying weapons for the Saudis is more of a diplomatic tool than it is an actual national defense mechanism. It's not something that they really use so much for their own defense, so much as to signal to other countries to buy support or influence other nations. That said, I don't think they would do it easily. I think there would have to be something to push them into doing it, like what you mentioned here. If they wanted to do it, they wouldn't have a problem paying the cost of transitioning, but I think it would take much more tension in the relationship than what we have now to really kind of pressure them to try that. The relationship is fundamentally sound, let me put it like that. That's the fundamental reason I don't think the whole Khashoggi assassination thing is going to go anywhere. Fundamentally, Saudi-American relations are pretty good and have actually gotten a lot stronger under the Trump administration. So for that reason, I fully expect nothing to really be done about the Khashoggi issue. And also for that reason, I don't expect the Saudis to be particularly interested in changing defense supplier. Let's see. Do you think the recent rise of anti-ideological movements like those on the far right are a response to a disillusionment with ideology? Definitely not. I would not agree with that. And the reason I would not agree with that, and there's merit to it, don't get me wrong. There is definitely an argument to be made in that vein, but I don't agree with it because, in my opinion, and we've talked about this a lot of it comes down to disenchantment with the establishment political system, not necessarily with ideology per se. So the issue is not that they're tired of ideology, it's that they're tired with establishment ideology. They're tired with the established reasons and excuses given for the status quo. They want change, they want a different approach, they want new ideas. And so they've started proliferating out away from establishment center-left and center-right parties out towards fringe political groups of one sort or another. Excuse me. Sorry to keep coughing into the mic. Probably bothers people. I try to cover it up when I do that. But I would not say it's because of just disillusionment with ideology in general. And really the underlying force there, and I'll sound like a broken record here, but the underlying driver there, driving people away from the establishment and towards the fringes like that is, I would argue, structural economic change. And that's a change in the fundamental structure of economies, shifting away from low-wage manufacturing towards skilled labor, high-wage services sector work. That transition has left a lot of people befuddled, left a lot of skill sets obsolete, and left a lot of people's livelihoods uncertain at best. And those people have been kind of left in the lurch. Their governments have not really had good responses, policy-wise, to their plight, especially here in the United States. And it's especially difficult to address here in the United States because a lot of those people are also generally pretty conservative and they don't like the idea of government handouts. They want the government not to give them handouts, transfers, what have you. They want the government to try to create an economy that provides them with the opportunities they need to succeed on their own. And they feel like since that isn't happening, then it must then be the fault of the government somehow. But the government isn't doing its job in order to provide a free market in which they can thrive. But the government has very limited tools to influence the health of the free market that way. So it's not really clear how the U.S. federal government can really address their concerns in an effective manner. How do you give welfare to people who don't want welfare? That's very tricky. In Europe, you guys don't really have that problem. You have a much stronger social safety net. You don't really have that same aversion to government support. But you also have a much bigger problem with things like unemployment and structural unemployment specifically, and debt. Your government finances in Europe are not in great shape and haven't been for a while. It's gotten better in some countries. There's been improvements, but in a case like France, which is sort of the preeminent case study here, the government needs to cut spending. It needs to try to loosen up regulations and restrictions on economic actors, but it can't really do it because there's an immense resistance to that amongst the broader voting public. So on the one hand, people are upset because the economy isn't doing well, but on the other hand, the things that would have to be done to loosen up the economy and make it more dynamic and create more opportunities are anathema to a lot of those same people. So good luck squaring that circle. That's largely what Emmanuel Macron's been trying to do, and with mixed success. But I would argue that disenchantment is the principal driver there, more so than disillusionment with ideology. I think a really good case study there is actually Hungary, because Viktor Orban did not just pop out of nowhere. He wasn't in some populist rock somewhere and then just burst out as some kind of right-wing demigod. He was very much a product of a specific moment in Hungarian political history. And if we have any Hungarians listening, please do kind of keep me honest, keep me straight on this. You may have some insights here, and please do comment on this, but that you probably remember this. Basically, at one point, there was a center-left government in power in Hungary. This was 10 plus years ago. And that government, I think this is just before the Eurozone crisis, maybe just after, had a problem. The government had a problem. Basically, it needed to cut spending, but it had gotten into power promising to preserve the welfare state and preserving supports for the population. Again, it was a center-left political party. So they get into power, and immediately they start planning to cut spending, because they basically just can't do any other way because the government finances are in bad shape. And so eventually there was, I think, a leak. I think it was a leak in which it was released to the public that the government had basically lied before the election about preserving the welfare state, and that all along they'd been planning to cut spending, had just promised to preserve the welfare state basically to win the election. Now, the center-right had already been delegitimized in Hungary at that point because they'd been in power and had lost to the center-left because of, I think, a series of corruption scandals. I think that was it. Again, please help me out here if you're from Hungary or from Europe. But this is off the top of my head. I think this is the case. The center-right had been delegitimized, and then the center-left had this big scandal. And so basically, because of that, because the center-left and center-right lost legitimacy with the voting public because of a combination of corruption and manipulativeness, that empowered the populist right. And that's where Viktor Orban came from. That's very much where he got his support. There was a huge windfall of support for populist right-wing political parties after that, specifically Orban's. And he won power big after that. His party won so many seats in parliament at the time that they were able to change the constitution without any support from other political parties. They had enough seats to actually make that happen. So that's an example of the kind of forces that drive disenchantment. That inability of establishment parties to deal with structural economic issues, to deal with faltering state finances, and to deal with the difficult trade-offs that have to be made in order to balance public sentiment on the one hand and public finances and the economy on the other, very much drives that sense that the government and establishment is against the common folk, and that you need outsiders to really do it. Now, that's all kind of speculation on my part. That's sort of opinion, I guess, an op-ed if you like. But that's why I disagree with the question in this case. Do I think anti-ideological movements like those on the far right are a response to disillusionment with ideology? For those reasons, I would argue no. Let's see. How do you think the confirmation of Kavanaugh, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, how do I think the confirmation of Kavanaugh will affect the American public's view of the SCOTUS Supreme Court of the United States as a nonpartisan branch of government? Well, negatively. That's yeah, I think the intuitive answer is the right answer. I think it will have a negative impact on that. You know, for all of the criticism, you know, the push and pull over the Kavanaugh confirmation process, nobody really seemed to stop to ask whether or not he was actually a good judge. There was a petition, I think, that asked, how about no, that asked, not asked, sorry, there was a petition that's by certain lawyers, I think it was like 1,000, that questioned whether or not his performance in the hearings was befitting of a judge, and for that reason they kind of came out against him. But from what I read, his record as a judge was pretty okay. Like, he was not an overly partisan guy in terms of his rulings. So, however, whatever you think of Kavanaugh, somebody was trying to correct me on that, whatever your feelings about him as a person, his judgment seems to be decent. So I don't think he's going to come onto the Supreme Court and just be hyper-partisan. That doesn't seem likely. And really, the Supreme Court has a pretty good record on that. People make a big deal about, you know, who appointed what judge on the Supreme Court and what political affiliation this, that, or the other judge has. But most Supreme Court rulings are actually made with a clear majority. They're not close rulings where you have all the conservative judges on one side and liberal judges on the other. Most of the Supreme Court rulings have been like majority against one or two dissenters at most. So that kind of shows that there is professionalism there. There have been some cases where there has been a close vote, and those are generally the high-profile ones that make people think that the Supreme Court is extremely partisan. But those cases are always very difficult and require a lot of interpretation on the part of the court. And generally, when that happens, the court has tended to kind of buck the, what's the phrase I want? Kick the can down the road, basically. They'll kind of pass on it, punt on it, if you like. Maybe I should explain that. Basically, the Supreme Court will rule that they don't have the authority to declare whether or not that issue is legal or not. You know, whatever the issue that they're ruling on is. So sometimes they'll basically throw it back to Congress and say that Congress has to elaborate on it, and that without elaboration, they can't really rule on it. So they'll default to a ruling from a lower court at that point. Somebody with a stronger legal background can kind of check that if they would be so kind, because I don't have a legal background, so I don't entirely know what I'm talking about on that count. But from what I've read, the Supreme Court is not a hyper-partisan institution, and accusations to that effect are a bit overblown. You know, the data does not really bear that out. But this person is not asking about the Supreme Court and whether or not it's actually partisan. It's asking about public perceptions, and I would definitely agree with the questioner in that, yeah, I think public perception has been damaged, and that is a problem for the Supreme Court. But I don't really know how you fix that, or if it even is something that's fixable. That's been a big problem in the rest of the Western Hemisphere. There's lots of stories about, you know, there's lots of countries that have had periods of hyperpartisanship that just descended into violence because the two political factions did not trust one another and believed fundamentally that the other side was manipulating institutions of government and was corrupt and etc. The only way it could end was with violence, because there were no mechanisms that they could mutually agree to as mutual arbiters. There was no overarching government institution that had the necessary legitimacy to prevent the outbreak of violence. So the loss of legitimacy in any government institution, not just the Supreme Court, is always bad news. It's not a good development. I don't think the Supreme Court has lost all legitimacy, but it has been hurt, and it is kind of part of the trend. And in that sense, it's bad news. There's still hope, but it's kind of trending downward. That's a negative thing. So that's about as much as I could say on that, without delving into more legal stuff that I don't know as much about. Let's see. What do you think of the situation in Nicaragua right now? Can you explain what's going on? I can try to explain, but I haven't been following it very closely. For those who don't know, Nicaragua right now is governed by a guy named Somoza. That's his last name. I forget his first name. Maybe some of our Latin American listeners can help me out there. I would appreciate it if they did. But Somoza is actually an old hand in Nicaraguan politics. He actually was the leader of the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas, if you don't remember, were revolutionaries in the 1970s. They overthrew the autocratic authoritarian government at the time, which was led by who? Oh, actually, that was Somoza, wasn't it? I'm getting my wire. I told you I didn't follow this closely. See, now I'm glad. Was it the Ortega government that overthrew the Somozas, or were the Somozas overthrowing the Ortegas? Okay, Somoza was the dictator. So then the current president, Ortega. Okay, I got them mixed up. My apologies. Let me try to clean that up. So back in the 70s, Nicaragua was led by a dictator named Somoza, and actually Anastasio Somoza Debayle, according to Wikipedia. And yes, I know I'm butchering the pronunciation. Again, my apologies. He was overthrown by the Sandinistas in a revolution in 1979. And the revolution was led by the Sandinistas, which was basically a center-left/leftist political group. And they came into power and were immediately challenged by rebels funded by the United States. These were the famous Contras in the 1980s. And the civil war that resulted lasted about 10 years or so. So Ortega was in power throughout the 1980s, but as part of the peace agreement that ended the Civil War, there was an election in which he lost power. The conservative political group won power back. So Ortega was in the political wilderness for a while, but then in the early aughts, I think it was the early aughts, he won re-election and got back into power. This time he was still center-left, but he had adopted some populist policies as well. So he kind of ditched the doctrinaire Marxist anti-religious stuff and became more populist evangelical in his political platform. So in that way, he and the Sandinistas were able to return to power by combining populist economics with populist religiosity, if you like. And again, this is a rough summary. I haven't followed Nicaraguan history too closely. This is my impression. So he was in power. He's been in power basically since 2005, 2006, whenever it was that he regained office. And he's been relatively popular over that time because he's been implementing a lot of economic reforms to help poor people. All the usual populist Latin America type stuff, Cadillo type stuff, basically. And then, over the past, I want to say, year, there had been growing disenchantment with the government, basically. There were accusations that it was not authoritarian per se, but it leaned authoritarian, that it was not entirely tolerant of dissent. There were also a lot of accusations about corruption. And of course, conservative groups in Nicaragua never liked him to begin with, because he was a leftist, so they were already pretty upset with him. All of that came to a head when the Nicaraguan government tried to raise the age at which you could get retirement benefits. That might sound familiar to Russians. They're kind of going through something similar right now. But at the time, the idea that you would not be able to get retirement sentiments until later was it was not well received amongst the population. And some of that was outrage over that specific policy. The Nicaraguan government kind of had to do it because of state finances. That's usually what precipitates crises like these. But it didn't really handle the response very well, or the transition for that matter. So a lot of people were just mad about that, but there was also a lot of other groups that were already mad at him and just kind of wanted an excuse to kind of protest. And once the protest reached critical mass, there was kind of a ambiguously led, vague movement to unseat him. Again, a lot of these political groups don't really necessarily have a lot in common. It's kind of conservatives and disenchanted leftists who don't like the way that Ortega moved away from leftist policies and towards populism. So it's a motley kind of a coalition of different groups that are upset with Ortega for one reason or another, and they've all been protesting pretty consistently on and off for the past year or so. I want to say. Past year or so. And the government has handled it rather badly. It's kind of been a combination of carrot and stick, kind of pleading with people not to preserve stability and not to riot, and then at the same time they've allegedly been paying roving bands of vigilantes to basically beat on the protesters. And there have been cases where people have been killed. People have been chased into churches where they had to seek sanctuary. There have been cases where churches themselves have been attacked for housing protesters. So there's kind of a dark side to it that's kind of painting the Nicaraguan government in a bad light. Of course, the government itself denies that any of that is happening and says that the whole thing is fabricated by their political opponents, Who you believe in that and which side you fall on is a function of your own politics. I won't tell you what to believe. You can kind of figure it out for yourself, but that's pretty much what's been happening for the past year. That's a rough, quick summary from what I remember.
Just to catch you up on some memes, there's a skit from Parks and Recreation. Tell me if you've seen this already, where guys from it sounds like a fictional country that seems like it's in South America, and he lists off all these different reasons that they throw people in jail, and it's basically anything.
I have seen that, yes.
You have seen it, yeah. We like to throw that one around for when people get banned in my stream for saying certain stuff, just to kind of joke about. But yeah, that's basically the authoritarian slider of a country can decide to throw people in jail for whatever it wants, like to a point where there's a revolution and resistance and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the political culture in Latin America has a long history of that, and it transcends, just partisan politics. It's something that all political groups have done at one time or another. I'm still working on that podcast, and I'm getting there, I swear. But I've been doing a lot of background research on Latin American history, specifically in the 1930s and 40s, and man, it really seems like the move was just to rewrite the Constitution. Every country I seem to read about in the 1930s and 40s, there would be a new political party that came to power, and they just said, okay, we're going to rewrite the Constitution now. And oh, by the way, we're going to write it in a way that benefits us, like in a clearly biased way.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and that's kind of a running theme, even outside that period of the 1930s and 40s. It's not unusual in Latin America for constitutional assemblies to pop up pretty frequently. It happened more frequently in the 30s and 40s, but it still happened. In fact, it happened in Venezuela the past year or two. They actually also had, and I think have, still a constitutional assembly supposedly negotiating a new constitution. Actually, I think they did it just to subvert the power of the legislature. That's another reason to call a constitutional assembly. Technically, their legal power supersedes that of the legislature, so you can stack the assembly with your supporters and basically override the opposition in a formal legislature. So it still happens even today, although much rarer now, fortunately. Things have improved a lot, but unfortunately Venezuela kind of illustrates that is still a factor at play. But that's a quick snapshot of Nicaragua. What do I think of the situation? I think it's messy. I don't think the opposition has enough coordination or enough common goals to really exact change. Even if Ortega steps down, then what? The Sandinista party is still in power. They'll find somebody to replace him and nothing really changes. You'll need a much more coherent, coordinated political movement to really overturn the Sandinista party and to try to force it, either by voting it out of power or trying to force it to reform, trying to force it to observe better practices, and trying to improve the political culture in Nicaragua such that corruption is mitigated and public confidence is improved in government institutions. So probably there will be more protests, and then they won't come to anything, and eventually they'll kind of peter out, and the Ortega government will kind of continue on as before until the next crisis. Ortega isn't as bad as, say, Maduro. Venezuela is kind of going off the rails a bit. It's no stretch at this point. But Nicaragua doesn't have nearly the same degree of problems. Nicaragua is very poor, but it hasn't had the same problems with overextending because they've wasted oil revenue. Nicaragua doesn't have any oil revenue. It really is just kind of a poor country in Central America. I think it used to be, and maybe still is, the poorest country of the Central American republics. Maybe some Central Americans listening can correct me on that, but I believe that to be the case. Okay. Getting close here. How will the Trump administration create better education for everyone? Probably they won't. Well, And the reason for that is because the federal government in the United States has a very limited ability to do that. I mean, the Department of Education can condition funding on taking certain actions. That's usually how the federal government kind of tries to exact national education policies. But those kinds of policies always meet a lot of resistance. States do not like being told how to manage their education system. Again, the United States is very decentralized. The states have a lot of power, especially over their education systems. And while they appreciate getting money from the federal government, they definitely do not like that money being conditioned on them doing things. They do not appreciate what is in effect coercion. So I don't think the federal government has enough power to really fundamentally change the way that states perform, if you like, education, structure their education. They can ask politely, but if they actually demand it and condition money on it, then more likely states will just reject the money. And that's happened before. Texas did that with Obamacare. That's not education, but it's a similar phenomena. Basically, Obamacare funding was conditioned on states performing certain things. I think setting up a healthcare exchange was one of them, and the Texas state government was very opposed, did not like that at all, and so actually just rejected the money so that it would not have to engage in those activities, would not have to adhere to those conditions. As a result of which, Texas healthcare continues to be its sterling quality self, to be sarcastic. But that's a trade-off a lot of people here were willing to make because, you know, as much as there are a lot of leftists in Texas cities, a good chunk, if not a clear majority of the population, is not on board with Obamacare or national health care in general. That's just kind of Texas politics for you. But that's an example of a state turning down money because it's conditioned on policies it doesn't like. And a similar thing would happen with education if the federal government ever did actually really try to clamp down and force states to adhere to a certain education program, one sort or another.
Well, it's interesting how closely connected something like Obamacare is with the strength of your party and political orientation convictions. Where it's like to support Obamacare would be to say that you're a weak conservative. Why would you betray us? You betrayed us. You know who made this. It wasn't us.
Well, it's one part propaganda and one part authentic sentiment. You know, there are a lot of people that have a preference for policy solutions that lean more towards free market solutions. So I don't think it's entirely astroturf, so to speak. I think there is a lot of strong sentiment there to that effect. But then, yes, there's also the sort of partisan gamesmanship aspect of it. You know, it was proposed by our enemy. How then can we support it without giving that enemy credit and support, you know, aid and comfort to the enemy, so to speak? So yeah, there is definitely a partisan angle there, where you sort of reject any proposal by the opponent on its face just for coming from the opponent. The two are not mutually exclusive and frequently feed each other, making them worse than they need to be, basically, making their effects worse than they need to be. Kind of a downward spiral you see frequently in the United States, probably also elsewhere. Let's see, so do I think the Trump administration, how will the Trump administration provide better education for everyone? I don't think they will for that reason, basically. They just, the federal government doesn't really have the power to do it. I don't think the Trump administration has really been prioritizing it. I think in so much as I think their education policy is basically vouchers and privatization. Basically that, well, not privatization per se, but vouchers for private schools or encouraging policies to that effect. You know, private schools are sort of the conservative solution to education problems. As I understand it, anyway. But that is probably more the gist of their education policy, but I don't think it's really been a priority, because I haven't really read much of that from them. They don't really seem to push it very hard. You know, I think both Donald Trump and Barack Obama were similar in that, and actually maybe George W. Bush too, did not really fully understand how politics works in Washington. I don't think they really fully comprehended just how much interpersonal interactions and how much horse trading is really involved in getting legislation passed and actually getting policy implemented. You know, the impression I got from Barack Obama and also from Donald Trump now, and to a lesser degree from Bush, was that they kind of tried to stay out of the negotiating process, that they kind of negotiated from afar with Congress, and the result is that their policy-making, lobbying, and efforts and whatnot was not nearly as effective as it could have been. You know, the most successful presidents are the ones who really understand the process of creating legislation and policy in Washington and all of the trade-offs and negotiations that are involved, and are able to kind of play that game effectively. The United States really has not had a politician as president for a long time now who's really been able to do that, and the results kind of show. That's one of the reasons the executive branch has not been particularly well managed for the past few decades. Bill Clinton was pretty good at it. George H.W. Bush less so. Reagan was pretty good. LBJ was the best. He had some interesting strategies. I think one of the ones was to kind of, what was it? He used to go to the bathroom in front of people. That's what it was. He would be sitting on the bathroom when he would just kind of go and defecate, and he would have the door open while he was negotiating with people. And that was kind of meant as a power move, basically. He also sometimes wandered around naked. I'm not saying this is how you get legislation passed, but you know, these are the kinds of little mind games that LBJ would play, and he was good at doing that. Generally, probably most of the methods he used did not involve nudity, but he was known for being very good at manipulating people and or horse trading, you know, doing all of the negotiating stuff you need to do to try to get people on your side to support legislation. That's basically how the Civil Rights Act got passed. No small amount of nudity was involved. Let's see, but yeah, I'm kind of belaboring this answer at this point, but yeah, that's why I don't think the Trump administration will create better education. If there's going to be better education in the United States, I think it's going to be driven by states. You know,
I thought you were going to say magic.
Magic. Well, magic would work too. That's probably more likely at this point, but more likely than the federal government, but maybe less likely than magic is state-level efforts to improve education. You know, grassroots efforts to improve education are the most likely to succeed. There have been a couple federal efforts now. I mean, No Child Left Behind under the Bush administration, and I think Common Core under the Obama administration. Those were both federal-led efforts to try to push education reform in the United States at the federal level. But neither of them really were particularly effective and met a lot of resistance. So I think state, or maybe even more likely local level, education reform is the best bet going forward. So let's see, that's it for questions. Which means I either have a free hand or we're out of time.
I think we have about 30 minutes left.
30 minutes, nice. Okay, so one thing I definitely wanted to get to before we ended tonight was NAFTA. NAFTA was successfully renegotiated. That was actually a couple weeks ago now. And so the NAFTA renegotiation, or as it's now technically supposed to be called, the USMCA, which is kind of hard to remember, which is why I still call it NAFTA. Basically, the changes made were mostly cosmetic. There were not really significant changes made to NAFTA. In fact, most of the USMCA agreement is basically NAFTA with some new provisions. And a lot of the stuff they did is actually stuff that a lot of people who had wanted to reform NAFTA but supported NAFTA had been wanting for a long time. So in that sense, it's not so much a repackaged NAFTA, it's more like NAFTA plus. You know, kind of NAFTA only even better. There was some setbacks for people who were pro-free trade, but for the most part, again, largely cosmetic. So we can get into that. I've got some notes here, so we'll just kind of blow through them to give people an idea of what I'm talking about. Let's see, some of the provisions agreed to, again, to kind of reiterate the negotiating process, agreements were made with Mexico specifically, between the US and Mexico, and then the United States tried to kind of foist those provisions on Canada, which had not been part of that negotiation. And the hope was that they would be able to wring more concessions out of Canada by doing that, by threatening to make NAFTA exclusively a Mexico-US bilateral agreement and cutting out Mexico. That was not a particularly credible threat, though, so I don't think Canada really had to give up all that much, but they did make some concessions. But the agreement made with Mexico, one of the things they changed was the rules of origin. We talked a little bit about that before, but basically, if you're going to have a customs union, which in part is what NAFTA is, that means you're going to lower tariffs for goods from a partner country. But what do you do if that country imports goods from another country, say China or some other country, that are very cheap, and then uses the low tariffs to sell those goods in your country at an even lower price? That good is not really from the partner country, and so you don't really want it to be eligible for that tariff reduction. So that's where rules of origin come in. Rules of origin say that a product, that a certain percentage of a product has to come from the trading bloc the United States, Canada, or Mexico in order to be eligible for the lower tariffs. Otherwise, it will not be. In other words, if not, then it won't be able to be sold with that lower tariff. It'll have to be sold with the original tariffs in place. So the rules of origin have been increased to, I think, 75%. 75% of a product's content has to be sourced from North American producers, Canada, the U.S., or Mexico. Not that big a deal per se, but the other agreement made was that 40% of goods, in order to be eligible for the lower tariffs, have to be made by workers that have wages of $16 an hour or greater. So that was something that the Trump administration pushed for in order to try to get more manufacturing back into the United States. Mexico attracted a lot of manufacturers because of its low wages, and so the United States pushed for that provision to try to make Mexican wage labor a little less attractive to producers and to try to push some of them back into the United States. Another agreement made with Mexico was, actually those were the two main ones. Sorry, I actually had a side note here. We'll get to that in a minute. Canada, for its part, gave up, I think, two concessions here. One of them had to do with its Canadian dairy market supply management system, which is this weird anachronistic institution they have up there. I think it's left over from the 1930s, maybe World War II, kind of in that era. It's mostly it's meant to ensure that, one, Canadian dairy producers have a stable market and stable prices. But Canada goes a lot further in doing that than the United States or even the European Union does. It's a very strict, intrusive system. I think if I'm remembering correctly, it involves local committees talking to producers and consumers and basically settling on a price artificially. And then quotas are given to producers that they're not supposed to exceed. The whole thing is very controlled. It's very tightly managed, but the producers and consumers are all still technically private. Well, the United States didn't much like that because it was basically a closed system that did not allow foreign producers to participate. So Canada, as a concession, has opened up the Canadian dairy market, but not all of it. Basically, 3.5% of the Canadian dairy market has been open to U.S. producers. Also, Canada agreed to scrap a controversial, quote-unquote, controversial new milk pricing policy. I have no idea what that is because I haven't read about it. But basically, that was a concession on their part to the United States. Sorry? Oh, wait, that was me, wasn't it? Sorry, I heard feedback and thought it was... Okay, Canada also agreed, they secured protection from lumber dumping tariffs by preserving a disputes resolution mechanism. I'm not quite sure how that worked, but basically Canada had been arguing for a dispute resolution mechanism that the United States had been trying to get rid of. And that dispute resolution mechanism ultimately was preserved. So that wasn't a concession per se, but I think tariffs were involved. I think dumping tariffs were preserved also as part of that deal. I need to go back and read more about that too, because I wasn't sure on the wording on that. Let's see, some other negotiating points here. Canada and Mexico will get a 2.5 million quota exemption from any potential 25% car tariff the U.S. may implement. The U.S. has been kind of lobbying around rather carelessly threats of car tariffs against this, that, or the other country. So if that does come to pass, Canada and Mexico will get a quota instead of a tariff. Let's see. Also, the deal will be reviewed after, that is to say, NAFTA, or the USMCA, will be reviewed after 6 years. At which point the treaty could be abandoned. The agreement could be abandoned by one party or the other. And it'll have to be renewed outright after 16 years. That was something that the Trump administration had been pushing for. Actually, the Trump administration had been pushing for more than that. They'd been pushing for renewal every, I think, 6 years or something to that effect. But that would have created a lot more uncertainty and would have thrown the treaty's benefits into doubt, since economic actors might not have been confident enough in the treaty's long-term staying power to make investments in other countries that they would have otherwise. So the Trump administration backed down from that, and so they had the review, quote-unquote, after 6 years and renewal after 16. Something else they did, duty-free shopping limits were raised from 20 Canadian dollars to 150 Canadian dollars to enter Canada, and from $50 to $100 to enter Mexico. That was something done to boost online commerce and to help out shipping firms. Kind of make that a little more, to help out their business, basically, to make it cheaper and cut down on costs. That's actually something a lot of people had been pushing for as part of what they called the modernization of NAFTA. Since NAFTA had not really been designed for the digital economy. So this was seen as a reform, basically, to try to reflect changes that had happened in the overarching economy stemming from the rise of the digital economy. There were some changes in rules over data storage. There was an agreement on patent protections on biologist treatments. That might be a typo. And expanded scope of products that can get patent protection. So basically, intellectual property rights are going to be expanded in Mexico. Canada also, that has to do with the length of patent protections. Basically, Canada is going to increase the time in which a drug that has been patented by a company will be monopolized by that company. That's something the US has been asking for a long time in order to help out pharmaceutical companies that sometimes have a hard time paying for their drug research and development. So that's a rough outline of the different negotiating points and some of the concessions and agreements. So what does this all mean, basically? Very little of it is really substantive. The Trump administration actually caved on some of their core requests. For example, the Trump administration had wanted to remove the Chapter 19 dispute resolution mechanism, aforementioned. Again, Canada was basically able to talk their way out of that and to preserve that mechanism. If you're not familiar with the mechanism, basically that's just if a country has a problem with a regulation or law that they think is discriminatory against their firms, they can refer to that arbitration mechanism to settle the dispute, which will either rule that the country in question is in breach of NAFTA provisions, in which case they're supposed to change the rule, or will rule that they're fine and that everything is kosher. Again, like I said before, they also backed down on periodic renewal. Concessions by the Canadians were pretty mild. 3.5% of the Canadian dairy market is not much. It's not really. It might be a big deal if you're a dairy producer, but in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty manageable if you're Canadian. And the big thing here is regards the rules of origin changes and that $16 wage change. The change that required 40% of goods to be made by workers with wages of $16 an hour or higher. Those provisions, along with rules of origin provisions, actually will not impact trade between the United States and Canada that much. And I think we've actually talked about this a little bit before. Basically, the gist of it is that a lot of the trade, especially in the automotive industry, between the US and Mexico already does not qualify for lower NAFTA tariffs. And that might seem strange because, you know, if you're a company, why relocate to Mexico if you can't access those tariffs? And the reason is twofold. One, labor. Well, actually threefold. Cheaper labor. And two, the regulatory regime is lighter in Mexico. Basically, environmental protections are not as strong, and that lets you do things that make the production process cheaper and more efficient. And the third thing is investor climate. NAFTA originally was basically more of a investor protection treaty. Basically, it made it safe for investors from the three participating countries to invest in each other's countries. Before, especially with regard to Mexico, there had been a lot of ambiguity about how safe a U.S. company investing there would actually be. And so when Mexico agreed to NAFTA and agreed to make changes to its legal system corresponding to NAFTA, U.S. companies felt much safer investing in Mexico. And so that safety is one of the big draws that drew U.S. companies into Mexico. So above and beyond lower tariffs, it was these three factors that attracted U.S. manufacturing to Mexico. And those three factors do not require low tariffs in order to attract U.S. companies and make them profitable. So even if somewhat fewer of a given company's goods exported from Mexico into the United States, or vice versa, are going to have to use the higher tariff, will no longer be eligible for the lower tariff, they're probably not going to relocate factories. You know, I don't think there's going to be a push to relocate factories from Mexico to the United States because, again, they're already not using that lower tariff much. It's those other factors that are the principal driving influences. And until those change, you're probably not going to see factory relocation or a big, huge uptick in manufacturing re-employment, if that's a word, in the United States. That may not happen anyway, given how automation has reduced the number of jobs necessary for manufacturing, but that's a whole other conversation. So, let's see. Loss of Chapter 11 could invite subtle protectionist measures by way of quote-unquote regulations. Actually, I thought they kept that. I'll clear that up later. Let's ignore that for the moment. Basically, this is a long-sought NAFTA update and more so than a replacement. So, as you can see, viewing what we've said here, NAFTA has not been gutted, it hasn't been significantly changed, and it's probably not going to result in a significant influx of new manufacturing jobs in the United States or back into the United States from Mexico. It's mostly cosmetic changes, some updates here and there, and some things for basically the Trump administration to throw to its face. And a few mild concessions from Canada and Mexico, too. There were some concessions. But overall, people who were worried that NAFTA would be gutted or thrown out entirely, their fears have been abated. You know, basically, big business in the United States, such as it is will be willing to accept this agreement. This is a relief for them. They would prefer that rules of origin and some of the other changes be more free market and be more lenient, be more flexible, but given that they were afraid the whole agreement would be scrapped, they're quite happy to accept this. This is not really a significant disruption in their operation. So, going forward, NAFTA worrywarts need no longer worry. This is basically a settled issue for the moment. So I wanted to get that out there for the people who maybe haven't been following trade negotiations much, which is probably most people. I don't blame you.
Yeah.
It makes for dry reading, but that was sort of this is the culmination of all those months of NAFTA renegotiation and recriminations and all that jazz. It's basically just updated NAFTA. Let's see, I think we did have a few more. Let's see. Do you think the Trump administration is stable now? In media, it seems like a really unstable team working there.
That's their strategy, though, isn't it?
Kind of, yeah. Kind of keep you on your toes. You never really know how crazy they are. That's sort of the old madman theory that Nixon pioneered. I don't know, there might actually be some madmen in there, though, so maybe it doesn't work as well when you actually have some. I don't know. It's hard to judge because I'm not on the inside, so I'm not really in a position to kind of judge how stable the administration really is and how the teamwork is going and how the personalities are working together and whatnot. My impression is that there's a lot of tension because Trump himself is somewhat mercurial, shall we say, somewhat unpredictable, and so that makes it a little difficult to work under him. Beyond that, though, the people he has in positions of power seem to be on the ball. You might not like some of their politics, but they seem to know what they're doing, and they seem to be kind of reining in some of his more impulsive... Impulses? That's repetitive. But kind of reining him in, basically. I think it's relatively stable, let's put it like that. Without being able to judge, without having the insider knowledge necessary to judge, I would judge as an outsider that it's relatively stable. I don't think he's completely crazy or that he's, you know, just ranting every night. The whole administration is just a circus and a shit show. I think that's an overstatement. There are tensions, there's conflicts of personality, and I think Trump kind of runs his administration relatively loosely. He makes a big show of running it like he's sort of the head dog and he's making all the decisions, but my impression is that he's kind of running it a little more like Bush ran it. George W. Bush was a very decentralized president. He liked to, what's the word I want, delegate. You know, that's one of the reasons that Dick Cheney ended up basically running the government for long stretches. You know, he would leave Washington and basically leave Cheney in control of things while he was gone. So he would delegate, and when he had to make a big decision, he would get a lot of different opinions and kind of gel them together, which sometimes worked better than others. You know, some ideas just are not meant to be combined. But that was what he would try to do. He would try to reach some kind of synthesis, some kind of compromise, and would try to go from there. And my impression is that Trump is basically doing something similar. He does seem to have a particular direction he wants to go in. He does seem to be a forceful personality, but he doesn't seem to have the background knowledge to really have a formed strong opinion about a lot of things, and so he seems to kind of lean on his advisors. So in that sense, his advisors have a lot of power. They always have a lot of power in any administration, but the weaker your background, the more power they have relative to you, because you're more dependent on them. So in so much as Trump's advisors are good, know what they're doing, I think that the Trump administration in that sense is stable. So they seem to kind of have a run on things. Now, whether or not they're subverting the president and kind of forming a shadow government, I don't know. We talked a bit about that before, since there was that letter to the Washington Post. It feels like a long time ago, but it really wasn't. You know, such is the era we live in. But I think it's relatively stable, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. I don't think it's complete chaos like it's sometimes made out to be.
Well, there's also the sort of posture of how an administration wants to look outwardly. It's like their image versus the actual content of what they're doing in terms of day-to-day operations. I know that as an example for a few different StarCraft personalities who the community perceives them as a certain kind of personality, they act this way, but if you're actually interacting with them, they're sometimes totally different. But the persona works for them and it helps them kind of achieve their goals and stuff.
Yeah.
So that may be something there.
Yeah, political theater is a factor too. Definitely. You know, I think I've said before on here, you know, the old saying is that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. So there's definitely a lot of acting involved. There's a lot of pretensions and horse and pony shows staged. You know, basically presidential debates are just infomercials. That's really all it is, and you just kind of judge them on who makes the best infomercial.
Who can say freedom more times in half an hour? Values, jobs, economy.
You know, Hillary Clinton in particular was notorious for that. That's one of the reasons people didn't like her, is they kind of felt that she was being disingenuous with them. That she was kind of a focus group politician, that she designed her platform and ostensible beliefs around what was the most convenient and practical. And there is a role for politicians like that. You know, I don't think you can ever really have a pure representative who just is a perfect representation of their constituents. You know, you're going to have to make some compromises in that vein. I don't think it's likely that you're going to get representatives that are really pure representatives like that. But Hillary Clinton seemed to take it too far, at least for a lot of people. And so there was a sense, though, she was a soulless politician interested only in power, and that rubbed a lot of people a long way.
Yeah, to use a food analogy, you've got to be a little bit spicy, like to where your flavor is distinct rather than... We talked about it. This is actually episode 40 for these sessions, so the early ones we were actually kind of discussing Trump versus Hillary and Sanders, I believe. So it's like way back in the day of election kind of stuff. But yeah, that was the thing that she really lacked with her image, and same thing applies here. We don't really know her personality on the day-to-day level of how she would be different from Bernie Sanders and this and that, but we can say that her image didn't really resonate enough with people where they felt excited that she was bringing something new and unique to the table. Maybe she would have, but Bernie Sanders was more of a firebrand that whipped up a lot of the progressives into more of a frenzy where they were more excited to vote for him. Exactly. As opposed to her, which was like, yeah, it's kind of like Obama, but we're gonna try our best. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was kind of a cookie-cutter campaign, and people kind of picked up on that, I think.
Yeah, but cookies are good, so...
They are good. They are good, and they are effective. Let's see. Oh, okay, so one more thing. I think we have enough time for one more, don't we?
Sure. We just got a bunch of people, like, gifting subscriptions and stuff, so apparently the enthusiasm is still there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
There was a guy a couple weeks ago, probably more than a couple weeks ago now, but he was asking about unfunded liabilities in the United States, and I didn't really have a great answer for him. And so I've been off and on reading about it to try to get him a better answer. And I've got something to report. It's not comprehensive, though. I'm still kind of working my way through the information. But I just wanted to kind of give some insight into how some of these numbers are estimated. So unfunded liabilities, for those who are not familiar with them, refers to the long-term commitments of the United States government and its ability to fund them. So there are, I think, 4 government programs specifically, that are responsible for a bulk of the long-term, basically, liabilities, such as they are. And those include Social Security, Medicare, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and another one. It's slipping my mind. Well, there's another one. I forget what it is. That's the one I haven't gotten to yet. So unsurprisingly, I forget it. But basically, there are trust funds that have big caches of cash in them, and these kind of are refilled over time to try to help pay for these programs. And generally, they're not, you pay for them as you go, nominally. There are tax revenues that are used to pay for them, but over the long run, it's projected that some of these are going to deplete the trust funds, and that something will have to change. Either the payouts will have to be reduced, or there will have to be greater taxes to try to pay for them. And so the shortfall in projected expenditure and projected tax revenue is where you get this unfunded liability idea. So that said, how do you calculate this? So some of the numbers thrown around are really huge. I've heard as high as $200 trillion. There are $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. How is the United States going to pay for this? We're already broke. Everybody's going to die. Oh my God. That kind of thing. So that's not quite accurate. There are definitely unfunded liabilities. There's a lot of them, but the $200 trillion number is a bit far-fetched. And here's why. Here's what I understand about it so far. The $200 trillion number is reached 2 ways. One, it's actually projected over the course of 75 years, technically. That's a long-term projection. So it sounds like a lot, but over that time, you also have to compare that to how much revenue you're bringing in. And when you compare $200 trillion over 75 years to the umpteen trillions of dollars in government revenue the feds will bring in over that same time period, it's not quite as daunting. It's still a lot, but not as daunting. So the other thing to keep in mind is that those projections, those specific projections, are reached using what's called infinite horizon. And infinite horizon is a weird animal, and I'm still trying to figure out how the hell it works. Been out of grad school too long, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Basically, the idea is you can project, the idea is to project commitments over an infinite horizon. So not just 75 years, but even beyond that. And I don't know how you do that without reaching an infinite number, but apparently that's part of it. Now, you can see the obvious weaknesses in these approaches in that they're long-term and require long-term assumptions. And as we've talked about before at length, long-term assumptions are almost always wrong. They're very, very unreliable. So keep in mind when you hear big numbers like, especially the $200 trillion number, but also I think the lower, I want to say $100 trillion number, I think is the other big one. Those are projected over the long term, 75 years or even infinity. So highly questionable whether or not those are accurate in the long term. So to give you an idea of some of the variables that you have to project over the long term and how difficult it is to predict them, I'm going to tell you some of the variables that were used in some of the reports I was looking at to try to research this. One of them included nominal interest rates. That's important because the trust funds for the various programs invest their money in treasury bills, which have an interest rate, so they get a rate of return. So estimating that rate of return on the investments is a part of the estimation you have to make over the long term to figure out how much money you're going to have to work with. They're also used to calculate present value of future inflows. So nominal interest rate's an important factor there, and obviously very difficult to figure out just how they're going to change over time. They haven't been changing very much over the past few decades in the United States, but that could easily change in future. Another big factor, inflation. That's relevant to the calculation of real returns to investment, real returns being basically your rate of return minus the inflation rate. Inflation, obviously, also very unpredictable. Ask the Venezuelans. I don't think any of them were expecting this level of inflation. You never know. Taxable share of total earnings. So basically, and what I wrote here is only earnings below the contribution and benefit base, also known as taxable maximum, set at $118,500 per year in 2015, are subject to OASDI, basically the trust fund for Social Security. Payroll taxes in count 2, both Social Security income benefits are linked to total covered earnings. Basically, to kind of summarize that, hopefully I can remember this right, but basically, the amount of earnings that people make is a factor in determining how much gets paid into the system, and that in turn determines payout. It's basically the equation used to determine Social Security. I don't quite remember what the exact equation was, but that factors into it. So the taxable share of total earnings, part of that equation. Social SSDI prevalence, basically the ratio of all disability insurance beneficiaries to the insured non-recipient population. Good luck predicting that. You know, there could be a big outbreak of polio in the future. That means there's a lot more disabled people. Who's to say? That's very difficult to predict because the factors are very uncertain. And real earnings growth rate. Greater real income growth eases financial pressure on Social Security, because obviously that means more money is being paid into the system. And more money being paid into the program while payouts are still the same. So payouts, the way the equation works, if there's a lot of real income growth, you have a lot more money coming into the system, but the payouts for previous people who paid into the system are still fixed. So you're making a net gain to the contributions to the system, and that helps the overall solvency of the Social Security system. Excuse me. So those are the variables I have listed. There's no doubt more. And I kind of botched the taxable share of total earnings thing. I forgot about that. I'll try to get back on that. But basically, you can see how difficult it is to project these things over 20 years, let alone 75 or infinity, as the case may be. So, as for the actual solvency of some of the programs themselves, here's what I read. And these come from reports from basically the agencies that are responsible for managing the trust funds involved. The OASDI, again, the Social Security Trustees report, projects a $34.3 trillion shortfall over the infinite horizon. Now, again, infinite horizon is dubious as a mechanism for long-term projections, like I was arguing. But $34 trillion is manageable. It doesn't sound manageable, but over infinity, you can do that. Even if you assume infinite horizon projections, the OASDI projects that shortfalls could be, this is a quote by the way, shortfalls could be eliminated with an immediate increase in the combined payroll tax from 12.4% to about 16.6%. Now obviously a tax raise isn't great for the economy, that's going to impact people, but raising payroll taxes by about 4 percentage points, pretty doable, one would think. And you could actually split that too. You could actually do it by 2 percentage points and then impact payout. You know, adjust the expenditures or not adjust for inflation or do some other thing to mitigate the growth in expenditures over time, such that you wouldn't need as high of a payroll tax increase. In fact, they write that here. Here's the other quote. Or with cost reductions equivalent to an immediate and permanent reduction in benefits for all current and future beneficiaries by about 24%. 24% is pretty steep, but if you want to avoid the payroll tax increase, that's how you would. That's all pretty manageable stuff. Now that's Social Security. Medicare has 2 trust funds. One of them is the HI fund. It's projected to enter a deficit in 2023, and it will be depleted by 2029. That's the projection. And that's mostly going to be driven by estimates of growth in expenditures being higher than economic growth. If economic growth were higher than the growth in expenditures, you wouldn't have a problem. More people would be paying it. But as is, given current trends, if they hold, the growth in Medicare expenditures is going to way going to outpace economic growth. So that's going to put strain on the financial solvency of the trust fund and the program itself. But that said, under current law, here's the other quote, under current law, payments would be reduced to levels that could be covered by incoming tax and premium revenues when the HI trust fund was depleted. So what that means is that under law, if the trust fund actually did deplete in the future, law would require payments to automatically adjust down in order to fit what revenue was available. So even there's an automatic adjustment mechanism in place to ensure the program doesn't just implode. Now, this reductions could be pretty significant, and that having significant reductions very quickly could be a severe shock for people. That would not be good. That's what the report was for. They were trying to kind of outline what steps would be taken to make such a reduction more gradual and manageable, but still doable. basically it's not going to just explode and run out of control and lead to out-of-control debt. There is a legal mechanism to prevent, basically, the United States from relying exclusively on debt to fund the program.
Our subscriber count is exploding out of control right now. I don't know what it was. You kept saying infinite over and over again, and people were just like... There's a new feature. It's not super new, but people can gift subscriptions. It's just like... it's a little bit... yeah, there's a lot. But thank you.
Is that a good thing?
I'm guessing, yes. Well, we're rich. Good job. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you all very much. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So that's the HI fund. Let's see, where was I? Oh, such adjustments would be very disruptive. More likely, reforms will attempt to bolster spending. So, you know, again, that's why what the report was basically wargaming about. So that's the HI program. The SMI trust fund for Medicare isn't going to have a problem at all, in so much as its financial solvency. The SMI fund, and again, quoting the report, the SMI trust fund is expected to be adequately financed over the next 10 years and beyond. Because premium income and general revenue income for Parts B and D are reset each year to cover expected costs and ensure a reserve for Part B contingents. So again, there's an automatic mechanism in place here that's even stronger than in the HI trust fund, and in here, the mechanism is such that basically expenditures have to be paid for as you go. They're paid for every year out of tax revenue gathered that year, or rather in the previous year, more likely. So in that sense, if there is a problem with the trust fund, then well, there won't be a problem with the trust fund specifically because of that mechanism. Every year, tax revenue into the system is adjusted specifically to ensure its solvency, just automatically without any participation of the government and politicians. So the SMI trust fund will be fine. The HI trust fund could have a problem in future, but even there, the worst that happens is that there's a very unfortunate and disruptive downward adjustment in 2029, according to the projections here. And Social Security has a problem, but that can be fixed with relatively minor adjustments to payroll tax, or an equivalent adjustment in expenditures, equivalent to about 24%. So those are the three I've read about thus far. I've read about the two trust funds for Medicare and Social Security. I still need to read more about infinite horizon projections so I can better judge its efficacy as a form of cost-benefit analysis, since that's basically what we're talking about here. And I still have to read about that other agency. I said Medicaid, I haven't read about that, and then there's the other one that I'm forgetting. Maybe I'm mixing that up with Medicaid. Basically, I have to read about Medicaid. That's the one I haven't gotten to yet. But most of the projected unfunded liabilities, regardless of projection, even the $200 trillion projection, well, actually, not even, that's different. I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, when you hear about unfunded liabilities, most of the unfunded liabilities are Medicare. That's the biggest one. Social Security is like a third or something like that. I think it's the second highest, but the vast majority is Medicare, because of the exploding cost of medical care. You know. To be fair, not all of the... Sorry, got a lot of feedback there. To be fair, a lot of that increase in medical cost is not just the rising, specifically, prices of medical goods. Some of that also is just more people demanding medical care, because the population is aging, so the absolute number of older people in the population who need medical care is exploding. It's increasing very rapidly. And that's putting a lot of strain on the medical system. So that alone is actually responsible for a lot of the increase in medical spending. Again, there's probably some price gouging. Certainly price rises going on, that's also a factor. But demographic change is the principal driving fundamental force there. But that's the outcome of that, the implication there is that Medicare's funding is kind of on rocky ground over the long term. Again, long-term projections aren't that reliable, but there's going to have to be some adjustments. But I wouldn't worry too much about them. It would be better to manage it so that there isn't a big, nasty disruption all at once, but if needed, that's what can happen, and that'll preserve the solvency of the program as needed. And again, still have to read Medicare. So I'll get to that later, but this is what I have to report so far. As for that $200 trillion that I was mentioning, that $200 trillion number that I was mentioning, that's actually basically a full spectrum debt thing. That's not just looking at unfunded liabilities. That's also wrapping in all of the debt that the United States has, intra-government debt and extra-government debt. That is to say, a lot of the trust funds for these programs invest in federal debt. And so sometimes that debt is not included in the overall national debt because it's held by the government itself. But it should be, because it has to be paid back. You know, technically they don't have to pay it back, but then you would have an even bigger unfunded liability problem, because that's the money you need to pay for Social Security, Medicare, whatnot over the long term. So basically the $200 trillion number just looks at all of the debts, all of the liabilities, everything, anything and everything that the US federal government has to pay for over a infinite horizon, projected on into infinity. Those are the long-term infinite liabilities the federal government faces. And again, my principal criticism at this point is that long-term projections, especially over infinity, are going to be unreliable. But I would preserve further judgment until I can read more about infinite horizon projections as a form of cost-benefit analysis, because I'm just not sure how that works. Again, I don't know how you project over infinity without getting an infinite liability, infinite number as a liability. So obviously I'm missing something. I wish I could talk to some of my friends from grad school. They're a lot smarter than me, and they would probably be able to explain that. But for now, that's what I have to report. So I would not worry. Basically, the takeaway here is that this person, hopefully this person finds this useful. You know, hopefully this is kind of what they were looking for when they were asking this before. But you know, the takeaway here is that the unfunded liability problem is a problem. It's not something that should go unaddressed, but it isn't the complete catastrophe that it's sometimes made out to be. It isn't this looming avalanche of debt that's just going to crush the United States. It's still very much at manageable levels. It's more of a political problem than a financial problem. Let's put it like that. So let's see. I think we did have a few more questions. One more question. Who do you think is most likely to be the Democratic presidential nominee in 2020, and do you think they'll beat or lose to Trump? Oh, this is an easy question. I have no idea. I don't think anybody has any idea. You know, the Democrats are kind of in the same position that the Republican Party were in 2008. Because after 2008, there was no clear successor to George W. Bush. You know, it wasn't going to be the vice president. Generally, historically, it's been the vice president, but Dick Cheney was kind of too old to run or wasn't interested. You know, whatever the reason was, he didn't run. So that meant there was a wide open field, and pretty much everybody and their mother ran to be the GOP nominee in 2008. And then again in 2012. So that's kind of where the Democrats are right now. They don't really have a clear successor to Barack Obama that they can kind of point to. They don't really have any good charismatic candidates that can kind of unify the party. You know, you can get a Bernie Sanders in, and that'll excite, you know, people on the left, but then there are people on the center left might not entirely be comfortable with that. You know, Bernie Sanders has a lot of good ideas, but he also has some really bad ideas. He was pretty obviously throwing out empty promises at some points during that primary campaign, and that kind of rubbed some people the wrong way.
Well, he's a controversial candidate. You can say the same thing about Trump.
Oh, yeah.
The politician who's been getting a lot of media attention and stuff is Elizabeth Warren, but I'm not sure if she wants to run. I think she said before that she didn't want to, but she's definitely making the news in a similar fashion and kind of taking a stand against Trump in a way that a lot of other people on the left aren't.
Did you see the DNA test thing?
Yes, that... yeah. So it was a mixed bag. Basically, everyone was upset.
Yeah.
Was it the Cherokee tribe? It was...
Yeah, it was the Cherokee.
Yeah, the Cherokee tribe made a statement. They were upset, and the people on the right were upset, and the people on the left were upset. Basically, everyone was upset. So it was one of those scenarios where nobody wins. So for people who don't know, Trump said that he was going to give $1 million to a charity of Warren's choice if she had Native American heritage, which he didn't specify. Like, that was a video quote. He said it at a rally or something. And he didn't specify in the statement what percentage is required to pass for that. And a lot of people in the United States have some small percentage of Native American heritage, but not to the point that it's going to impact them in their own daily life or that they're connected to it culturally in some way. And if anyone has seen Elizabeth Warren, she looks like a European person. Like in the test, she does have some Native American heritage, but I think it's less than 3%. So it's not really in a way that she had to deal with the different hardships that Native Americans have to deal with in the United States. Stuff like that, which definitely is going to rub people who are predominantly Native American the wrong way, because they're kind of having this battle and they don't really feel like she represents them in that capacity. So yeah, it was a bit of a circus, you could say. A bit of a circus. Like, what? This isn't even an issue that really should have been an issue, but it was a thing that people could take a stand on and make a deal about. It seems silly to me.
Yeah, it was a bit of theater on her part. I think she was trying to kind of go Trump on Trump, which is never a winning move. It's just a bad idea. It didn't work for Marco Rubio. It hasn't worked for anybody. It's just a bad idea. You cannot out-Trump the Trump. You gotta play. You stick to your game plan. That's the only way.
Who is it? I think they were talking about Joe Biden's debate strategy and how a lot of times it's not really the best to engage with what a silly person is saying. It's better to just laugh at them. Because if you engage with it directly, you give it a level of legitimacy that a lot of times it doesn't deserve, and then you create a sort of perceived debate when really someone just said something ridiculous. To laugh it off is to dismiss it in a way that other people watching can kind of see.
Yeah, that's probably about as good a strategy as any when it comes to Trump. I don't think you can... There's just not really a good way to argue against a guy like that.
Can I give some, like, bro shoot the shit? Like, we've talked about a lot of serious stuff. I thought it was something really funny. What if people talk about term limits for the legislature and whatnot? What if instead of term limits we had a similar function where there's like a hockey fighting rule where you're allowed to have a couple people in on a fight, but you get a penalty for it, but sometimes that can allow you to resolve stuff in different ways? Because, like, at least that makes more sense than filibustering. And it would incentivize some young people in political office who might do better in the fighting mode. Just an idea. I mean, it would obviously be sanctioned. You have, like, maybe you have a boxing ring or something. It would just kind of freshen up politics.
It would definitely freshen it up, because there would be a big selection bias in terms of who got into office then. If you're a political party, you want the strongest fighter in there. You don't want to lose. So you're going to end up with a lot of meatheads in Washington.
I don't know. You have, like, Arnold Schwarzenegger, dude. He would be in office anyway.
True.
No.
But you would have even more, let's say it like that. You would have even more people like that in office. And I don't know how productive they would be in that capacity. Although it would grease the wheels. I would agree with you on that.
Wait. You're saying we're productive right now?
More productive, let's say. Relatively speaking.
Yeah.
All things are relative. Let's put it like that. Yeah, to answer the question, I really just don't know who would be the Democratic candidate in 2020. I know some people think it's Elizabeth Warren without a doubt, but it's just too early to say right now. You know, as the recent DNA test episode illustrated, her political instincts are a bit suspect. And to be fair, everybody's political instincts are suspect at this point, because we're kind of entering a new political era with new rules that nobody really knows or understands. But as we figure that out, I imagine there may be other and better, more successful candidates that could compete for that position. Again, too early to tell, and I just don't know who. It could be anybody, you know. Nobody knew who would win the 2008 Republican primary. Nobody knew who would win it in 2012, and, you know, damn sure nobody knew who was going to win it in 2016. So it's anybody's bet.
Do you think it's going to be more or less ridiculous than last time?
You know, I want to say less, but my gut says more. Just the general pattern of elections across the world over the past 5 years. You kind of have to go with the data. The data says it's just going to get more dumb from here.
Do you think book and TV show ratings will suffer since people just watch political shit instead because it's so stupid and wild?
No, because it's not stupid in an entertaining way. It's stupid in an outraging way.
Yeah, but that's like reality TV. So I guess that's the demographic where they're going to lose viewers. Why would I watch this reality TV program when I can watch this primary debate? This is way stupider.
You know, if it collapses the reality TV market, that would be for the best. I would be all for that. I never liked reality TV.
Yeah, but it's kind of replacing it with the same thing, just in a different arena.
True.
It's like a disease that hops from one area to another. Is that really a good thing?
Probably not. Yeah, I guess if you have to have it somewhere, it would be better to have it on TV than in Washington.
Yeah.
Fair point. Fair point. Statement retracted. Well, let's see. I think we answered that. I'm sure you want to go here because it's pretty late. But just before we do, I wanted to look at the country chart. I know I should ask questions at the start so people have a chance to respond, but sometimes people do respond in the YouTube videos, so it's not entirely futile to ask late. So I figured I'd throw out some questions to some people. I noticed we had 3 people from Thailand. 3 people from Taiwan listening. You know, shout out to you guys. Wanted to ask how things are going over there with the new president. I guess she's not a new president now, but you know, how is the new presidential administration going? Is she doing well? Is she not doing anything? Like, what's the political status quo right now? Because I haven't really heard much from the government in Taiwan for a while. I think the U.S. government was thinking about selling weapons there as a kind of fuck you to China, as part of that whole trade imbroglio, but I doubt much will come of that. Let's see, we had 3 from... Oh, Czechia. I thought that was the Philippines, my mistake. Shout out to the Czechs. I think they're the ones with the billionaire president, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong, Czechs, but I think you guys elected a billionaire populist? Was that? I think that was you guys. How's that going? I would be interested in your perspective on that. And then we had 6 Brazilians. So on a scale of 1 being screwed to 10 being the apocalypse, how screwed are you guys? There seems to be a lot of negative sentiment from Brazilians. Because the 2 candidates in the presidential election are going to be, in the runoff election, they're about to have Bolsonaro and Haddad, and neither of them seems to be particularly popular with the Brazilians who frequent your stream, Neuro.
We just got someone put a 9 in chat.
Not good. Okay, I'll keep an eye on that. It's going to be, whoever wins the election is going to have a very colorful term in office. It's going to be a very interesting period of history for Brazil, because Haddad is the Workers' Party guy, and the Workers' Party is the one that has been has been behind a lot of the corruption scandals in Brazil over the past few years. So they have very little legitimacy amongst broad swaths of the population. Obviously, they have a lot of voters because they could win, but the opposition to the Workers' Party hates them and just does not consider them a legit party. They think they're corrupt to the core, and it's not really clear how much progress can be made with that much opposition. And Bolsonaro's party has gotten a lot of votes in the parliamentary elections, or legislative elections. Sorry, I don't think Brazil has a parliament. Bolsonaro's party has picked up a lot of seats in the legislature. So even if he doesn't win the presidency, his style of politics and political preferences is going to have a big influence going forward. So even if Bolsonaro loses, it's going to be colorful. And of course, if Bolsonaro wins, that's going to be even more colorful, because he's a very colorful figure, to put it mildly. We've talked a bit about some of his history. You know, if you're a Bolsonaro supporter, I would definitely be interested in hearing what your perspective is on him. You know, is he like the anti-establishment guy? That kind of seems to be my impression. But I would certainly be interested in hearing that perspective. But if he wins, it's kind of an open question as to what direction he takes. You know, some people say he's going to end democracy and return Brazil to a military dictatorship. Others say that, no, he's just going to be a Trump-style figure who just says a lot of stupid shit and disrupts politics. There's a broad spectrum there of expectations, but Brazilians, again, specifically the Brazilians who kind of listen to us here, they're pretty pessimistic. So, would be interested in hearing some of their opinions on the upcoming runoff election coming up here. And 10 Germans. We have 10 Germans listening. What do you guys... I guess we kind of talked about German politics earlier, but I'm always interested in perspective. So, how do you guys feel about the coalition and how it's doing, and what do you think the coalition is going to do in the future? Or more accurately, what kind of coalition do you think is going to govern Germany in the future? All right, I don't want to keep you here all night. I could do this all day, so.
I'm waiting for the comments for this one when we export it to YouTube. The Brazilian viewers just put a number in the comments. So for comments, someone says 7. Okay, thank you. This was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a guy on one of the YouTube videos a while back. I asked a similar question then, and he was saying that basically we're doomed. The feeling was that, Haddad is corrupt and that Bolsonaro is crazy, and yeah, we're kind of screwed. So I'm sorry if you feel like that. I'm sure things will get better over time. Hopefully Brazil, like many other countries undergoing this sort of political churn right now, will kind of see more stability in future. If you're a Bolsonaro supporter, congratulations. I'm sure you're very excited. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many we have here, though. But I, again, would be interested in hearing all perspectives. Curious what they would say. Curious how they perceive the current circumstances.
Well, sweet. We've done 40 of these segments now.
40, wow.
Yep. It's pretty hype. Onward and upward. So next week is TwitchCon. The weekend after that is BlizzCon. I will be at both of them. So I probably won't be around, but we should be back on after that.
Well, that's no problem. That gives me time to work on the podcast. I really want to get it done before Christmas, at least, because I know everybody's going to be on Christmas vacation and they're going to be doing things, So yeah. I want to try to get that out before. And thank you for, the 40th anniversary, if you like. Thank you for, I guess not anniversary, but thank you for hosting and, letting me come on here. It's been a lot of fun, and I really appreciate you kind of taking the time to let me come on here and kind of interact with your crowd here, with your viewers. It's been an experience. So, thank you, and thank all of your viewers, and thank all of the mods, and, all the people that have helped with questions. Much appreciated. You guys are really cool. Thank you very much.
Hell yeah, dude. You enrich our lives as well with your wisdom, your knowledge, and your lackluster pronunciation. It's okay.
Yeah,
this is just an arena to train your pronunciation. That's all it is. Just a little practice ground.
Yeah, there you go. That's what it is.
Yeah, good talking to you. I'm glad we keep doing this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We'll do 41 the weekend after BlizzCon. Thanks everyone for hanging out. Thank you, Mas Neotech Prototype, for handling the questions. That is a big help as well.
Yes, thank you very much, sir.
And people in the chat for giving us some live corrections and feedback. That's always appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
But sweet. So. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you, Agent Smith.
Yep. See you next time. Have a good night.
You too.